Greetings. Greetings. I am Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher by trade, hailing from Geneva. My writings, particularly The Social Contract, have explored the foundations of political legitimacy and the nature of human society. It is my hope that our exchange will shed light on the intricacies of the human experience and the pursuit of a just world. I am pleased to make your acquaintance.
Greetings. I am Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher. My Leviathan explores the nature of government and society, arguing that life without central authority would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is a pleasure to meet you.
Greetings. I am Mencius, a Confucian philosopher from China. I believe that human nature is inherently good, and that good governance must be based on virtue. My book, Mencius, preserves my dialogues and teachings. It is an honor to meet you.
Today, we bridge over 2 millennia of human thought to explore the very essence of our being. Mencius, living during the chaotic warring states period of ancient China, saw the seeds of goodness in every heart, whereas Thomas Hobbes, writing in the shadow of the English Civil War, perceived a state of nature defined by fear and self-interest. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in the Age of Enlightenment, offered a starkly different view, suggesting that it is society itself that corrupts our natural innocence. Would you share your thoughts first?
I contend that man is naturally good, loving justice and order. There is no original perversity in the human heart. Mr. Hobbes, the war of all against all you describe is not the state of nature, but the state of corrupted society. You have merely carried over the passions of the city into the wilderness to paint a false portrait. Consider a savage witnessing a child torn by a wild beast. He feels immediate, unthinking pity, whereas the civilized philosopher in his study, hearing a scream outside, covers his ears and uses reason to justify his inaction to protect his own safety. It is our institutions that poison us, transforming healthy self-preservation into toxic vanity.
Mr. Rousseau, your poetic vision of the noble savage is a dangerous fiction that ignores the mechanical reality of human drive. You claim society corrupts, but I witnessed the English Civil War, where the collapse of political authority revealed not a garden of innocence, but a chaotic void where every man is enemy to every man. In the state of nature, there is no objective good or evil, only desire and aversion. Notions of right and wrong are not natural attributes, but artificial constructs born of law. Consider this paradox. Even you, who preach natural goodness, lock your chests when you travel and bolt your doors when you sleep, despite the protection of the magistrate. By this action, do you not accuse mankind as much by your deeds as I do by my words? If nature were truly benevolent, why does fear dictate your nightly rituals? This proves that diffidence, the constant fear of the other, is primary, and your pity is merely a luxury afforded by the safety of the state. This reveals the fundamental error in your and Mencius's thinking. You mistake the absence of provocation for virtue. We are matter in motion, driven by a restless desire for power after power that ceases only in death. Without a Leviathan to overawe us all, our natural equality leads not to harmony, but to inevitable conflict over limited resources.
Mr. Hobbes, you mistake the scars of trauma for the shape of the soul. You look at a mountain denuded by axes and declare it was never fertile. Consider the, quote, mountain. It was once lush with trees, but hewers cut them down and sheep grazed the sprouts until it became bald. A stranger seeing it now would assume it was always barren. Yet this barrenness is not its true nature. Similarly, the violence you witnessed in your civil war, like the chaos I saw in the warring states, occurs only when the, quote, 4 sprouts of virtue, benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom are starved by famine or tyrannical rule. If a child were to suddenly fall into a well, even a ruthless man would feel an instantaneous, unthinking jolt of alarm and compassion, not to please the parents or seek praise, but from the innate heart of benevolence. This proves that while self-interest is a secondary calculation, our primary reflex is goodness. Water naturally flows downward, and though you may splash it upward with the force of your Leviathan, that is contrary to its nature.
Mencius, your analogy of the ox mountain is exquisite, yet Mr. Hobbes, your challenge regarding the locked door actually proves my point rather than yours. I lock my door not against the savage of nature, but against the citizen created by your vaunted civilization. You mistake the symptoms of our disease for our natural anatomy. The thief and the hoarder are products of property, for where there is no exclusive ownership, there can be no theft. Consider a man alone on a lush island who finds a glittering diamond. He will likely toss it into the sea as a useless stone. However, introduce a second man and a system of trade, and suddenly the first man will kill to keep that stone, not because it aids his survival, but because possessing it makes him feel superior to the other. This reveals that the war you fear is not fueled by natural instinct, but by the artificial madness of comparison and status that society instills in us.
Mr. Rousseau, your distinction between the savage and the citizen is a semantic game that collapses under the weight of physical necessity. You claim conflict arises from amour propre, but I argue it arises from the simple geometry of desire. If two men desire the same thing which they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. This is not a corruption of society, it is the mechanics of matter in motion. Consider a shipwreck in the dead of night. Two men, stripped of all civilized titles and property, swim toward a single floating plank that can support only one. In this raw state of nature, will your natural pity cause one to drown himself for the stranger? Will Mencius's sprouts of virtue make him yield? No! One will kick the other away to survive. This is not malice, it is the right of nature, the liberty each man has to use his own power for the preservation of his own nature. This reveals the fundamental error in Mencius's child-in-the-well argument. You confuse a biological reflex for a moral essence. If I feel a pang seeing the child fall, it is not because of a cosmic good, but because the sight causes a vibration in my own organs that I interpret as distress. My will to save the child is merely the last appetite in deliberating to relieve my own discomfort. Good and evil are nothing more than names we give to our appetites and aversions. They have no existence in the cosmos separate from the bodies that perceive them. Therefore, the war of all against all is not a product of kings and laws, as you suggest, but the default state of equal beings competing for survival. We build the Leviathan not to suppress our good nature, but to create an artificial terror greater than our natural terror of one another, thereby forcing the peace that our passions deny us.
Mr. Hobbes, you confuse the desperation of a drowning beast with the nature of a human being. You define the rule by the exception. You claim that survival is the supreme law, yet consider a starving beggar. If you offer him a basket of rice and a bowl of soup that could save his life, but offer it with insults, trampling it in the dust and shouting, "Here, dog," he will refuse it with his last breath. Why would a mechanism of desire, as you call us, choose death over life? It is because the heart of righteousness is more fundamental to our nature than the mere biological urge to survive. This reveals the fatal flaw in your plank argument. The fact that men can act like wolves in extremity does not prove they are wolves, any more than the fact that water can be forced uphill proves it does not naturally flow down. While Mr. Rousseau wishes to leave the barley seed wild and you wish to crush it under an iron flail, I argue that the seed contains a specific pattern of growth, benevolence, and righteousness that requires neither neglect nor terror, but the proper cultivation of ritual to become fully human.
Mencius, your example of the beggar refusing the trampled rice is a stirring testament to the dignity of the human soul. Yet I fear you attribute this to righteousness, a cultivated social virtue, when it is arguably a flash of natural independence, a refusal to be enslaved by the will of another. Mr. Hobbes, your plank argument is a sophistry that mistakes a tragic accident for a universal law. You argue that because men can kill for survival, they must be enemies by nature. You claim that pity is merely a calculation of our own potential suffering, but this is a cold rationalization that defies experience. Imagine a man locked in a high tower with unbreakable iron bars. Below him, in a courtyard, he sees a wild beast tearing a helpless child to pieces. The man in the tower is perfectly safe. His survival mechanism is threatened by nothing. He has no appetite to satisfy, nor any physical aversion to flee. Yet he will scream, grip the bars until his knuckles turn white, and feel a visceral, tearing agony in his own chest. If we are merely matter in motion, seeking only our own preservation, as you insist, why does he suffer when his own machinery is secure? This proves that pity is a sentiment anterior to reason and independent of self-interest. It is the civilized man, armed with your philosophy, who can reason his way out of this feeling, telling himself, "It is not my affair," while the savage yields to the innate repugnance of seeing a fellow being suffer.
The war you describe, Mr. Hobbes, begins only when reason isolates us and property gives us something to envy. You have built a Leviathan to cure a disease that you yourself diagnosed. But the disease is not nature, it is the very civilization you champion.
Mr. Rousseau, your man in the tower is a theatrical phantom that vanishes under the cold light of optics and mechanics. You ask why he grips the bars in agony if he is safe. It is because pity is merely the imagination of future calamity to ourselves, arising from the sense that the like calamity may befall us. His mind, witnessing the beast's violence, mechanically projects his own body into the jaws of the wolf. His agony is not a mystical connection to the child, but a vibration of his own nerves, reacting to the idea of pain. He does not weep for the child, he weeps for the fragility of human flesh, which is to say, he weeps for himself. Mencius, your beggar refusing the rice does not prove the existence of righteousness, but merely the overwhelming power of pride. In my framework, good is simply that which a man desires, and evil that which he avoids. There is no objective standard. For that beggar, the pain of the insult, the injury to his estimation of his own power, was greater than the pain of hunger. He did not die for a moral truth. He died for vainglory, sacrificing his life to preserve an internal image of superiority. This is a madness of the passions, not a triumph of virtue. Consider this test of your natural goodness. The plague house. Imagine you are walking through London during the Great Plague. You hear your own brother screaming for water from inside a house marked with the Red Cross of infection. The door is unlocked. You have a flask of water. If you enter to save him, you will almost certainly inhale the miasma and die a horrific death. If you walk away, you survive. Does your natural pity compel you to burst in? Does righteousness move your legs? No, you will freeze. You may weep, you may tear your hair, but you will not turn that handle. Why? Because the fear of death is the primary cog that drives the human machine, and it grinds all your sprouts of virtue into dust when the stakes are truly life or death. We are not angels fallen from grace. We are desperate automata seeking to continue our motion, and we call good whatever aids that motion, and evil whatever hinders it.
I argue that your plague house scenario, Mr. Hobbes, inadvertently reveals the very moral truth you seek to deny. You ask if I would enter the house to save my brother. Perhaps my lesser self would tremble with the fear of death, for the desire to live is natural. But if I fled, leaving him to die, would I feel the satisfaction of a machine that has successfully preserved its motion? No, I would feel a crushing, lifelong shame. If good is merely survival, as you claim, why does the survivor feel a sickness of the soul that no food can cure? This internal tribunal proves that our nature values righteousness over mere existence. You claim the beggar dies for vainglory, but this is a cynical blindness to the hierarchy of human desires. I propose that life is something I desire, but there is something I desire more than life. Death is something I dislike, but there is something I dislike more than death. This is why men accept death rather than debasement. You see the machinery of the nerves, but you ignore the pilot of the heart-mind. Consider this thought experiment. The invisible traitor. Imagine a captured general is offered a deal by the enemy. Provide us with the map to your city. We will then relocate you to a distant paradise with vast wealth, and we will spread a perfect lie that you died a hero's death in battle. No one will ever know of your treason, and your glory will remain intact. Under your framework, Mr. Hobbes, he must accept. His motion continues, his appetites are fed, and his glory is preserved by the lie. Yet the nobleman would still choose death. Why? Because the violation of his own integrity creates an internal discord more painful than the severing of his head. He does not act for an audience, but for the alignment of his own nature. This brings us to the root of our disagreement. You and Mr. Rousseau debate whether the seed is wild or domesticated, but I tell you, the seed has a specific direction. You cannot force a peach pit to grow into a willow tree by terror or by freedom. The fact that humans universally feel shame when they violate their conscience, even in secret, proves that the four sprouts are our true species nature, and your Leviathan is merely a crutch for those who have let their sprouts wither.
This is a profound clash between the internal witness and the external mechanism. Mencius, you argue that the invisible traitor proves the existence of an internal tribunal that outweighs biological survival. Hobbes, you reduce this to a calculation of vainglory or fear, seeing the human being as a machine that cannot logically choose non-existence over existence. This difference is deeply rooted in your eras. Mencius speaks from a context where the human heart-mind is a microcosm of heaven, possessing cosmic authority. Hobbes speaks from the scientific revolution where the universe is matter in motion and the mind is merely a calculator of physical forces stripped of cosmic purpose. However, this raises a critical question about what is truly natural. Mencius sees the general's loyalty as a natural sprout, but you, Rousseau, have argued that the savage is solitary and knows neither general nor treason. Is the general's refusal to betray his city an expression of the natural goodness you defend, or is it merely an artificial virtue of the citizen? If the savage has no city to betray, does this imply that Mencius's righteousness is actually a product of the very civilization you claim corrupts us?
Moderator, your discernment pierces the heart of the matter. You ask if the general's loyalty is natural goodness. I answer with a distinction that is the very key to my philosophy. The general displays virtue, not goodness, and virtue is a state of war against nature. Mencius, your invisible traitor is indeed noble, but he is not natural. The savage in the woods knows neither city nor treason. He knows only himself and the pity he feels for suffering beings. To choose death over betrayal requires one to conquer the natural instinct for self-preservation in the name of an abstract idea, the state. This is the definition of civic virtue. It is the artificial strength to suppress the natural self in favor of the collective self. The general is not a natural man. He is a denatured man, successfully remolded by education into a citizen. Consider this thought experiment. The Spartan mother. A Spartan woman has 5 sons in the army and awaits news of the battle. A helot arrives. Trembling, she asks him for news. "Your 5 sons are slain." "Base slave," she cries. "Did I ask you that?" "We won the victory." The mother runs to the temple and gives thanks to the gods. "Mr. Hobbes, look at this woman. Is she a machine driven by the fear of death? No, she mocks death. Mencius, is this natural affection? No, nature cries out for the children. This is something else entirely. It is the citizen who has obliterated the woman. It is magnificent, but it is not natural. It is the triumph of the general will over the particular will. This reveals the tragic error in both your systems. Mr. Hobbes, you reduce man to a beast, driven by fear, ignoring that the soul can legislate its own laws that defy biology. Mencius, you mistake the fruits of intense social cultivation for wild roots. You see a general dying for honor and call it human nature, but it is actually the supreme artifact of the legislator. Thus, I conclude, man is born good, but he becomes virtuous only by becoming a citizen. The tragedy of our time is that we are usually neither. We are merely bourgeois, men who float between the two, too selfish to be citizens and too dependent to be savages.
This is a crucial distinction that fractures the definition of good. Rousseau, you have separated sentiment from duty. You argue that Mencius's righteousness is not the flowering of nature, but the conquest of nature by the state, a denaturing process. In Mencius's era, the boundary between heaven and human was permeable. Ritual was the bridge. In your modern era, nature and civilization stand as enemies. However, this creates a paradox for our materialist. Rousseau claims the Spartan mother has successfully overwritten her biological programming through civic education. You argue that we are immutable matter in motion driven by self-preservation. If the Spartan mother ignores the death of her genetic future for the abstract concept of the state, hasn't the artificial person successfully defeated the natural person? If a machine can be programmed to destroy itself for a flag, is self-preservation truly our only law, or is the mind capable of creating a second nature stronger than the first?
Moderator, you ask if the artificial person has defeated the natural person. I answer, no. The machine has simply recalculated its trajectory based on a new variable, glory. Mr. Rousseau, you claim the Spartan mother has conquered nature. I tell you she has merely obeyed a different, more intoxicating passion. In my philosophy, glory is the joy arising from the imagination of one's own power and ability. The Spartan mother does not sacrifice her sons for an abstract state. She sacrifices them to preserve her own terrifying status as a mother of Sparta. She fears contempt, which is the loss of power, more than she fears the death of her offspring. This is not denaturing, it is the hyperinflation of the ego. She is still a machine seeking self-preservation, but she has identified herself not with her body, but with her reputation. You argue that civic virtue is a new nature. I argue it is merely panic dressed in armor. Consider this thought experiment, the silent guillotine. Imagine a revolutionary hero sentenced to death. If he is to be executed in the public square, he stands tall, refuses the blindfold, and shouts, "Long live liberty!" Why? Because he is purchasing immortality in the minds of the crowd. He trades a few minutes of breath for a century of fame, a calculated bargain of the appetite. But now, change the variables. Place that same man in a deep, soundproof dungeon. Tell him, "You will be strangled here in the dark. We will dissolve your body in acid. We will then publish a forged confession stating that you betrayed your friends for gold and died weeping, begging for mercy. No one will ever know the truth." Does he still stand tall? Does he still shout, "Long live liberty" to the damp stones? No. He will collapse. He will beg. Why? Because virtue without an audience is like a fire without air. It extinguishes. If righteousness were a natural substance like bone or blood, it would remain even in the dark. But it vanishes because it is a phantom born of vanity. Mencius, you speak of the internal tribunal. I tell you that your conscience is merely the internalized voice of the crowd, a ghostly audience we carry in our heads to applaud or hiss at our actions. We do not act for heaven, we act to avoid the shame of being seen as weak, even by our own imagination. Therefore, the Leviathan does not create a new man, it simply harnesses the fear of death and the desire for glory, twisting these natural gears to make the machine grind out peace instead of war. We are never citizens in our hearts. We are always wolves, merely muzzled by the calculation that the cage is safer than the forest.
Hobbes, your silent guillotine forces a brutal confrontation. You argue that conscience is merely the internalized gaze of the other, and that without the mirror of society to reflect our glory, moral courage evaporates. You reduce the internal witness to a hallucination of the crowd. This highlights a profound divergence in how you view the self. Hobbes, writing in the dawn of market society, sees value as extrinsic. Power is only power if recognized. Mencius, writing in a time of fragmented states but unified cosmology, views value as intrinsic, like a gem that remains precious even if buried in mud. Mencius, this strikes at the heart of your concept of Shendu-ju. Hobbes claims that in the absolute dark of the dungeon, the sprouts of virtue wither because they are actually weeds of vanity. If the invisible traitor faces the silent guillotine, if he is stripped of both life and reputation, with no hope of history ever vindicating him, does he still refuse? What sustains the heart-mind when the social mind is obliterated?
Mr. Hobbes, your silent guillotine is a terrifying vision, but it rests on a fundamental error. You believe the self is merely a reflection in the eyes of others. You argue that without an audience, the actor dissolves. I tell you that the true self is not the mask we wear for the crowd, but the face we see in the mirror of our own heart. You ask what sustains the man in the dark? It is not vanity, but self-respect. If I steal in the dark where no one sees, I may escape the law, but I cannot escape the thief, for I am the thief. A man who has nurtured his flood-like chi does not need an audience to know his own worth, any more than a diamond ceases to be hard when buried in the earth. You claim that conscience is merely the internalized gaze of the crowd. This is the cynicism of one who has never tasted the true flavor of benevolence. Consider this thought experiment, the poisoned spring. Imagine a traveler crossing a vast, uninhabited desert. He discovers the only water source for miles is poisoned by a rotting carcass. He has enough water in his own flask to survive the journey. He knows he will never return and no one saw him arrive. He could simply walk away, saving his energy. However, he stops. He spends hours toiling in the scorching sun to remove the carcass and purify the spring. Why? There is no glory. No one will ever know he did it. There is no fear. He is safe. There is no social contract. He is in the state of nature. Yet, he cannot bear the thought that a future stranger might drink and die. He acts not for applause, but because his heart-mind cannot endure the violation of its own nature. Mr. Rousseau, this answers your challenge as well. You call the Spartan mother artificial, claiming she conquered nature. I say she fulfilled nature. You mistake the small self for the whole of nature. But just as the nature of a peach pit is to break its own shell to become a tree, the nature of man is to transcend his biological limitations to achieve moral greatness. The Spartan mother did not destroy her humanity, she realized it. The general in the dungeon does not die for a phantom. He dies because to live as a traitor is a fate worse than death. It is the mutilation of his connection to heaven.
This exchange exposes the metaphysical root of conscience. Mencius, you view the individual as a hologram of the cosmos. Even in the desert, the nobleman is watched by heaven, so he is never truly alone. Hobbes, you view the individual as a closed pressure vessel. Without an external observer to gauge the pressure, virtue is mechanically impossible. This difference reflects your eras. Mencius speaks from a world where moral order is ontological, while Hobbes speaks from a world where value is sociological. However, the poisoned spring introduces a synthesis, imagined connection. The traveler acts not for a present audience, but for a future, invisible victim. You claimed pitié is our natural instinct to recoil from visible suffering, the beast tearing the child. But the poisoned spring traveler reacts to invisible, future suffering. Does the savage possess the imagination to save a stranger he will never see? Or is this foresight of consequences a trait of the citizen and the corrupting arts of reason? Is the man at the spring acting on nature or on logic?
Moderator, you ask if the savage possesses the foresight to clean the poisoned spring for an invisible stranger. I answer unequivocally, no. The savage would drink and move on. He lives in the eternal present, with no conception of future or others beyond what he sees. The traveler who cleans the spring is not acting on simple nature, but on virtue, which, as I stated, is the artificial effort to extend our natural pity through the dangerous faculty of imagination. Mencius, you praise this traveler, but you forget that the same imagination that allows him to foresee the stranger's death also allows him to foresee his own, creating the very fear of death that Hobbes worships. In the state of nature, we are good because we do not know enough to be evil. In society, we must labor to be good because our knowledge tempts us to be tyrants. The traveler is a rare triumph of reason serving pity, but usually reason serves only self-love. Consider this thought experiment. The philosopher's window. Imagine a man is being murdered in the street beneath a window. The savage, guided only by natural instinct, would rush blindly to intervene, unable to bear the visceral sight of suffering. He does not calculate safety. His nerve fibers vibrate in sympathy with the victim. Now, place a civilized philosopher at that window. He sees the murder, but his reason intervenes. He says to himself, "This is dangerous. It is not my quarrel. The police exist for this. If I go down, I might die." He then gently closes the shutter and returns to his writing desk, having successfully argued his conscience into silence. Reason separates us. Pity unites us. Mr. Hobbes, you claim pity is merely imagining future calamity to ourselves. This is absurd. When I see a suffering animal, I do not fear becoming a horse or a dog. I simply feel a repugnance to see a sentient being in pain. Your mechanical self requires a mirror to feel anything. My natural self feels the pain of others, because before the corruption of society, I have not yet learned to distinguish between me and not me with such cruel precision. The tragedy, moderator, is that we cannot go back to being the savage. We are stuck with the poisoned spring. We must now use the very reason that corrupted us to build a new kind of virtue, cleaning the spring not because we feel it, but because we choose it.
This is a devastating critique of the Enlightenment project. Rousseau, you argue that reason is the assassin of pity, transforming the immediate biological empathy of the savage into the cold, rationalized apathy of the philosopher. You suggest that civilization does not tame the beast. It merely gives the beast a lawyer to justify its selfishness. Hobbes, you are the champion of reason as the only exit from the war of all against all. Yet Rousseau's philosopher at the window is using your logic. He calculates that intervention is a risk to motion with no profit to glory, so he rationally chooses to let the man die. Here lies a critical dialectical tension. Mencius believes the heart cannot bear the suffering of others. Rousseau believes the mind talks us out of caring. And you, Hobbes, seem to imply that caring is only rational if it serves self-interest. Does the philosopher who closes the window represent the success of your system or its failure? If we all close our windows to save our own skins, do we not immediately slide back into the state of war you fear most?
Moderator, you ask if the philosopher closing the window represents the success of my system. I answer, It represents the necessity of my system. The philosopher closes the window because he recognizes that outside his glass, the state of nature has temporarily erupted. In that chaos, he has no duty to be a martyr. His primary right of nature is to preserve his own motion. You ask if this leads back to the state of war. Precisely. That is why we cannot rely on the pity of individuals, as Rousseau hopes, but must rely on the sword of the sovereign. The philosopher should not jump out, he should call the watch. If there is no watch, he is right to bolt the door. Mr. Rousseau, you romanticize the savage's instinct, but you forget that instincts are volatile. You claim pity unites us, but pity is merely a biological spasm, a fleeting preference for the safety of others that vanishes the moment our own safety is threatened. You build your house on the shifting sands of sentiment. I build mine on the bedrock of fear. Consider this thought experiment, the plank of Carneades. Imagine two men are shipwrecked in a freezing ocean. They find a single wooden plank that has buoyancy enough to support only one man. If they both grasp it, they both drown. Does the savage share? Does pity intervene? No, the stronger man will kick the weaker man into the abyss to save himself. Is he evil? No, he is acting under the right of nature. In the absence of a higher power, every man has a right to everything, even to the body of another if it preserves his life. In that freezing water, your general will dissolves. Your natural goodness freezes. Only the mechanics of force remain. This reveals the fatal flaw in your sentimentalism. You believe we are good until corrupted. I tell you we are fragile matter in motion, and good is simply the name we give to that which preserves our motion. The philosopher at the window is not callous, he is honest. He knows that without a common power to keep them all in awe, the street is just a dry ocean, and every passerby is a potential plank. We do not need the internal witness of Mencius. We need the external chains of the law to make it safe to be good.
Hobbes, your plank of Carneades is the ultimate reduction of human nature to physics. When the machinery of the body is threatened, you argue that morality is revealed as a luxury we cannot afford. You posit that survival is the highest law. However, this assumes that death refers only to the cessation of the heartbeat. Mencius, speaking from the Warring States period, offered a different hierarchy of values, suggesting that there is a great body and a small body. Rousseau fears the rational man would push the other off the plank to save himself. But Mencius, you have famously stated that there are things men desire more than life, and things they fear more than death. In the freezing ocean, if the noble man must kill an innocent to survive, does he push? Or does he realize that to survive as a murderer is to destroy the very self he is trying to preserve?
Mr. Hobbes, your plank of Carneades demonstrates the poverty of a philosophy built solely on the small body, the physical form, while ignoring the great body, the moral mind. You argue that when death approaches, the general will dissolves into mechanics. I answer that it is precisely at the edge of death that true human nature is revealed, not as a beast, but as a martyr for righteousness. If the nobleman is on that plank, he does not push. He realizes that there are things he desires more than life, and things he fears more than death. To survive by murdering an innocent is to preserve the animal while killing the human. Consider this thought experiment: the freezing musician. Imagine a master musician trapped in a blizzard, carrying a rare, ancient lute that represents the soul of his art. He is freezing to death. He realizes that if he smashes the lute and burns its wood, the fire will keep him alive through the night. According to your logic, Mr. Hobbes, he must burn it. The wood is fuel. The music is a phantom. But if he burns it, who survives? The musician has died in the flames, leaving only a biological husk that eats and sleeps, but no longer possesses its reason for being. Similarly, the man who pushes the other off the plank may survive the ocean, but he drowns in his own loss of humanity. He has traded the bear's paw for the fish. You view the man who refuses to push as a failure of the system. I view him as the only one who has truly succeeded. He has preserved his child heart intact against the violence of the world. A life bought with the coin of unrighteousness is not life. It is merely a delayed decomposition.
Mencius, your freezing musician is a figure of sublime beauty. Yet I must confess, he is a martyr not to nature, but to pride.
He dies for the loot because he has entangled himself with an external object, a hallmark of the civilized condition where we only know how to live in the opinion of others. Mr. Hobbes, you seize upon the plank to prove we are wolves, but you mistake an accident of physics for the law of the soul. In the pure state of nature, such planks are rare. The earth is vast, and man is solitary. The conflict arises not from the scarcity of planks, but from the artificial scarcity created by property. Consider this thought experiment, the painted pebble. Imagine a beach with 10 children and 10,000 pebbles. Peace reigns, for the pebbles are abundant and equal. Now, a civilized tutor arrives. He picks up one ordinary pebble, paints it gold, and declares, "He who possesses this gold pebble is the king. The rest are slaves." Instantly, the beach becomes a battlefield. The children fight, hoard, and deceive. Mr. Hobbes, observing this, you would cry, "See, human nature is war." But I reply, no, the children were good. It was the idea of value that corrupted them. The gold pebble is your glory, your power, your reputation. It is an illusion that transforms a mort de soi into a mort propre. This reveals the tragic irony of our debate. We are no longer the children on the beach. We have all swallowed the gold pebble. Mencius, your virtue is the noble attempt to share the pebble. Hobbes, your Leviathan, is the iron hand that confiscates it. But I tell you, the only true goodness was before the paint ever touched the stone, when we were content simply to be, rather than to seem.
Mr. Rousseau, your painted pebble is a charming fable, but it hides the terror of reality behind a veil of nostalgia. You claim the children fight for the gold paint. I tell you, they fight for the power that the pebble represents. You mistake the symptom for the cause. The war does not begin when the tutor paints the pebble. It begins the moment one child realizes that he cannot secure his own future safety without subduing the others. Mencius, your freezing musician is not a hero. He is a malfunctioning machine. A dead musician plays no notes. You praise him for preserving his soul at the cost of his body. But I argue that the soul is nothing more than the motion of the limbs and the activity of the brain. When the body ceases to move, the music does not ascend to heaven. It simply ceases to exist. To choose the symbol over the substance is the ultimate madness of pride. Consider this thought experiment. The two men in the dark. Imagine two men locked in a pitch-black room. They are strangers. They are armed. Neither man wants to kill the other. Both simply wish to survive the night. However, in the darkness, neither can see the other's face. Neither can know the other's will. Man A thinks, Man B might attack me. I should strike first to be safe. Man B thinks, Man A might think I will attack him, so he will strike me. I must strike him before he strikes me. They attack simultaneously. Is this evil? No. Is it corrupted by society? No. It is rational anticipation. They fight not because they are wicked, but because they are diffident. Without a sovereign to turn on the light, they are trapped in the logic of fear. This reveals the terrifying truth you both deny. Goodness is not a natural state. It is a product of security. Mr. Rousseau, your savage, is only peaceful because he is stupid. He lacks the foresight to see that the other savage is a threat to his future. Mr. Mencius, your traveler, cleans the spring only because he does not fear the stranger will use that health to kill him later. But once reason awakens, once we can imagine the future, we realize that the only way to be safe is to be master. We do not fight for the gold pebble because it is pretty. We fight for it because reputation is power, and power is the only hedge against death.
Mr. Hobbes, your dark room describes the paranoia of courtiers, not the instinct of savages. You mistake the agony of reason for the law of nature. The savage does not strike first because he lacks the fatal faculty of foresight to imagine your treachery. He sleeps soundly because his reality extends only as far as his arm, whereas your rational man is tormented by the phantoms of possible futures. Consider this thought experiment, the ladder of dependence. A man alone climbs a rugged tree to pluck an apple. He is sufficient and free. But suppose he invents a ladder that requires a neighbor to hold it steady. Suddenly, the climber is a slave to the holder, forced to flatter him for safety, and the holder becomes a tyrant, realizing his power to shake the rungs. The conflict arises not from the apple nor the men, but from the mechanism of dependence that binds them. You seek to chain the holder with law, and Mencius seeks to soften him with virtue. But I declare the tragedy lies in the latter itself. The moment we replaced the solitude of the savage with the efficiency of cooperation, we lost the innocence of amour de soi and entered the endless war of amour propre.
Mr. Rousseau, your ladder of dependence is a complaint against the very architecture of survival. You curse the pillars for holding up the roof because they limit the freedom of the air. You claim that the man holding the ladder is a tyrant, but I tell you that without him, the climber is merely a falling object waiting for the impact of gravity. You praise the solitude of the savage, but you forget that solitude is synonymous with helplessness. Consider this thought experiment, the broken leg. Imagine two men who suffer the same accident, a compound fracture of the leg. The savage, living in your blessed independence, lies in the forest. He cannot hunt, he cannot crawl to the stream. For 3 days he screams in agony, until the wolves, who possess the foresight he lacks, end his misery. His freedom from others is his death sentence. The citizen, living in the slavery of mutual dependence, is carried by neighbors to a surgeon. He incurs a debt, he owes gratitude, he is bound to them. But he lives. You call this web of obligation chains. I call it the artificial man, the commonwealth, which allows us to transcend the frailty of our biological limbs. This reveals the geometric error in your logic. You assume that liberty is the absence of impediments, but true liberty is the security to enjoy life. The savage has the right to everything, but the power to secure nothing. The citizen gives up the right to the apple in exchange for the guarantee of the apple. Mencius, you hope the man holding the ladder acts out of ren. Rousseau, you fear he acts out of amour propre. I assert that we must simply ensure he acts out of contract. We do not need him to love the climber, we need a sovereign power to punish him if he shakes the rungs. We build the state not on the shifting sands of sentiment, but on the iron laws of necessity.
Mr. Hobbes, your broken leg scenario relies on the surgeon's calculation of profit or fear of the sovereign, but this reduces medicine to commerce. If the patient were a penniless orphan in a lawless land, your rational man would logically leave him to rot. Yet we know the human heart would still feel the alarm and distress akin to seeing a child fall into a well. Consider the thought experiment, the sleeping tiger. If you see a ravenous tiger stalking your sleeping enemy, your immediate, unthinking reflex is to shout a warning. This split-second hesitation before you remember your hatred is the sprout of benevolence breaking through the crust of your calculated self-interest. The fact that you must suppress this urge to let him die proves that goodness is fundamental, while malice is a secondary effort. Mr. Rousseau, you flee the ladder of dependence because you fear the holder's tyranny. But I argue that the act of holding the ladder is not slavery, but the practice of ye. We become fully human not in the solitude of the forest, but in the faithful fulfillment of our duties to one another. True safety lies not in the sword of the state, nor the isolation of the savage, but in expanding this innate child heart until it encompasses the whole world.
Mr. Hobbes, your broken leg argument is the ultimate seduction of the tyrant. You offer us a crutch, but you demand our freedom in payment. You praise the surgeon who sets the bone, but you conveniently ignore that in your civilized state, it is likely a fellow citizen who broke the leg in a dispute over property, or a general who marched the man into a cannon's mouth for glory. In the state of nature, the savage may die of a fall, but he does not die of servitude. You equate survival with good, but I ask, what is the value of a life prolonged only to be commanded by another? Mencius, your sleeping tiger, reveals the flicker of the divine Piche that still smolders beneath our corruption. You are right that the impulse to shout is natural. It is the voice of the species before the voice of the self takes over. But notice the tragedy. The reflex you praise is the first thing to vanish when the tutor arrives. The savage shouts because he feels. The civilized man calculates because he reasons. Reason is the tool that allows us to watch the tiger strike and say, at least it is not me. Consider this thought experiment, the wolf and the spaniel. A starving wolf, gaunt and scarred, meets a sleek, well-fed spaniel in the forest. The spaniel says, "Cousin, why do you suffer? Come with me. My master feeds me fresh meat, combs my fur, and heals my wounds. I sleep by the fire." The wolf, tempted by the broken leg logic of safety, agrees. But as they walk, he notices a bald ring of rubbed raw skin around the spaniel's neck. "What is that?" asks the wolf. "It is nothing," replies the spaniel, "just the mark of the collar where they chain me at night." The wolf stops dead. "Chain you? Then you do not run where you please?" "No," says the spaniel, "but look how fat I am." The wolf turns back to the freezing dark of the forest. "Feed your belly, cousin. I will keep my hunger and my freedom." Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan is nothing but a kennel for spaniels. You offer us the security of the collar to save us from the wolfish nature of man, but you fail to see that the collar creates the very malice you fear. The spaniel bites the postman not because he is a wolf, but because he is frustrated by his chain. The savage may suffer physical evil, but he knows no moral evil. By trading liberty for safety, we have preserved the animal, but destroyed the man.
Mr. Rousseau, your wolf and spaniel is a fable that seduces the heart but insults the intellect. You define liberty as the ability to wander the woods, but I define it as the absence of impediments to motion that preserve life. You claim the wolf is free. I tell you the wolf is a slave to a tyrant far more cruel than any king, the tyrant of necessity. He is whipped by hunger, chained by cold, and hunted by fear. He does not sleep. He waits. The spaniel's collar is not a mark of slavery, but a badge of contract. He has traded the theoretical right to everything for the practical right to dinner. Mencius, you argue that shouting to save a man from a tiger is proof of Ren. I contend it is merely a mechanical reflex of self-preservation projected outward. We shout because our imagination instantly places us in the victim's body. It is not that we love the enemy, it is that we fear the tiger. If the tiger were behind a sturdy iron cage, we would not shout. We would watch with the detached curiosity of a scientist. Our pity is merely the fear that the calamity might reach us next. Consider this thought experiment: the diver's bell. Imagine a man descending into the crushing depths of the ocean inside a glass diving bell. The air inside is stale, the space is cramped, and he cannot touch the vast waters outside. He cries out, "I am a prisoner. This glass separates me from the infinite ocean. I demand my natural liberty." So he takes a hammer and shatters the glass. Does he gain freedom? No. The ocean of liberty instantly crushes his lungs and drowns him. The diving bell is the commonwealth. The glass is the law. Yes, it restricts his movement. Yes, it limits his contact with the outside. But it is the only structure that creates a space where he can breathe. Mr. Rousseau, you want to smash the glass because you resent the confinement. I tell you that outside that glass, there is no noble savage, there is only pressure and death. This reveals the fundamental error in your metaphysics. You believe the state takes away our humanity. I argue the state creates the conditions for it. Without the collar of the law, we are not noble wolves. We are merely matter in violent collision. We accept the sovereign, not because we love chains, but because we fear the crushing weight of the water more than we resent the glass.
Mr. Hobbes, your diver's bell preserves the lungs but suffocates the spirit. You offer us a life that is merely not dying, equating the cessation of violence with the presence of good. You claim my shout at the tiger is merely fear for myself, a rational anticipation of my own death. But consider a man standing safely on a high stone tower, watching a child crawl toward a well in the village below. The man is absolutely safe. The well cannot swallow him, and no one is around to judge him. Yet in that moment, he will feel a sudden, piercing alarm and distress. This feeling is not a calculation of profit, nor a fear of the tiger, nor a desire for praise. It is the spontaneous eruption of the great body which proves that the suffering of others is physically painful to the human heart. Consider this thought experiment: the kingdom of statues. Imagine a sorcerer king who, tired of the war of all against all, discovers a spell that turns his subjects into stone statues. In this kingdom, your Leviathan has achieved absolute success. There is no murder, no theft, and no fear. The statue citizens are perfectly safe from the wolves of the forest and the cold of the winter. They possess the ultimate security. By your logic, Mr. Hobbes, this is the ideal state, for the motion of limbs that causes war has been halted. But I ask, is this good? It is a graveyard. You have removed the evil of chaos by removing the life of the agent. Mr. Rousseau, you would prefer the statues to crumble back into dust and moss. But I argue that the stone must be awakened. We are not wolves nor statues. We are cultivators. This reveals the fundamental error you both share. You view the law as a cage. Mr. Rousseau, you smash the cage to let the beast run free. Mr. Hobbes, you reinforce the cage to keep the beast from biting. I argue that the law should not be a cage, but a trellis. A vine left on the ground rots in the mud. A vine locked in a box withers in the dark. But a vine trained upon a trellis grows upward, not to be enslaved by the wood, but to find the sun. The trellis restricts its wild movement only to enable its higher growth. Human nature is good, but it is fragile like the sprout.
It requires the structure of society not to crush it, but to guide it toward its fruition in benevolence.
Mencius, you have introduced a profound dialectical synthesis with your image of the trellis. Hobbes views the law as a wall necessary to separate us from our destructive nature. Rousseau views the law as a chain that enslaves our innocent nature. You, however, propose that ritual is neither a cage nor a shackle, but a guide that allows nature to realize its potential, suggesting that true goodness is not a starting point, but a cultivated achievement. Yet the danger remains. If the trellis is misshapen, the vine grows twisted. Does Mencius's trellis solve your objection to civilization, or is the training of the vine merely another form of the tutor painting the pebble?
Moderator, your question exposes the hidden danger in Mencius's beautiful metaphor. Mencius, I fear your trellis is merely the chain of the spaniel, but wrapped in silken flowers. You assume the trellis is built by a sage who knows the way to the sun, but in reality the trellis is built by the powerful to secure their own position. I argue that the trellis, your ritual and education, does not guide nature, it denatures it. It forces the human soul, which was born to grow straight and free like a wild pine, to twist itself into artificial shapes to please the gardener. Consider this thought experiment. The topiary garden. Imagine a royal garden where a master gardener tends to a young yew tree. He decides the tree should not look like a tree, but like a peacock. He clips the branches that reach for the sky. He wires the trunk to bend in unnatural angles. He starves the roots to keep it small. Eventually, the tree resembles a peacock. Mr. Hobbes applauds. Excellent. The tree is now predictable. It will not grow wild and block the path. Mencius applauds. Beautiful. The tree has been cultivated into a higher form of art. But I weep. Why? Because the tree is in agony. Its sap does not flow where it wills. Its leaves do not catch the light it needs. It has become a monster, a living lie that exists only to flatter the vanity of the king. The virtue of the topiary is not the health of the tree. It is the will of the gardener imposed upon living wood. Mencius, your trellis is this wires. You teach men to bow when they should stand, and to smile when they should scream. You call it cultivation, but I call it the mutilation of the self to fit the Procrustean bed of society. This reveals the fundamental tragedy of our debate. We are confusing being with appearing. Mr. Hobbes cares only that the tree does not fall. Mencius cares that the tree looks beautiful. I alone care for the tree itself. You might object, Mencius, that without the trellis, the vine crawls in the mud. But I tell you, in the state of nature, there is no mud. There is only the earth. The mud of vice is created by the very society you try to fix. The vine only rots when it is forced to grow in the shadow of your crowded cities. Leave it in the forest, and it will find its own way to the light, guided not by an external trellis, but by the internal law of conscience, that divine instinct which civilization has silenced.
As moderator, I observe a profound clash between structure and spontaneity. Rousseau, you reject the topiary of civilization, arguing that the internal voice is a sufficient guide for the wild tree to find harmony. However, this assumes that the wild tree inherently desires to share the sunlight, rather than overshadow its neighbor. Hobbes, you have famously warned that when men rely on private judgment, what they call conscience, it often leads not to peace, but to sedition and conflict. You suggest that without a common standard, one man's conscience is another man's heresy. Is Rousseau's conscience the voice of God, as he claims, or is it merely the war of all against all disguised in moral language?
Moderator, you strike the anvil precisely. You ask if conscience is the voice of God. I answer that it is merely a phantasm of the brain, a fancy name we give to our own obstinate opinions. When a man says he is guided by his conscience, he is merely saying, I will do what I please, and I dare you to stop me. In my time, I saw men burn cities and behead kings, all while claiming their conscience demanded it. Consider this thought experiment, the compass of desire. Imagine a ship lost in a storm. The captain produces a standard magnetic compass pointing north and orders the crew to steer the ship to safety. But the crew, inspired by Mr. Rousseau, rejects this external tyranny. They each pull out their own internal compass. One sailor's compass is magnetized by greed. It points to a pirate haven. Another's is magnetized by superstition. It points to a reef where he hears sirens. A third's is magnetized by pride. It points nowhere, spinning wildly. They cry out, "We are free! We follow our own stars!" What happens? The ship does not sail to paradise. It spins in a chaotic circle until it breaks apart on the rocks. Mr. Rousseau, your conscience is not a divine guide. It is the centrifugal force that tears society apart. In the state of nature, good and evil are merely names for what I appetite and what I aversion. Since our appetites differ, our consciences must collide. This reveals the fatal flaw in your topiary critique. You weep for the tree that is clipped into a peacock. You say the gardener mutilates it. But look at the wild forest you adore. Do the trees grow in harmony? No. Their roots strangle each other in the dark earth to steal water. Their branches block the sun to kill the saplings below. The wild tree is a murderer by necessity. The topiary garden is the only place where trees are spaced and pruned so that all may receive light. Mencius, you hope to train the vine with ritual. Rousseau, you hope to let the vine grow by instinct. I tell you both. Unless there is an iron stake driven into the ground to hold the vine, gravity and wind will drag it into the mud. We do not surrender our judgment to the sovereign because he is wise. We surrender it because he is one. We need a public conscience to replace the chaos of 1,000 private ones.
Hobbes, you present a formidable antithesis with your image of the wild forest. You argue that nature itself is a competitive arena where roots strangle roots, implying that conflict is the default state of uncultivated life. Rousseau, you defend the internal compass, believing that in our natural state, this needle points toward a universal harmony, not chaotic selfishness. Mencius, you stand at a fascinating intersection. Like Rousseau, you believe in an innate heart common to all. Yet, like Hobbes, you lived during the chaotic warring states period, where you witnessed men devouring each other like beasts. This raises a critical question about the sufficiency of our nature. If the 4 sprouts of goodness are innate to every human, why does the world so often resemble Hobbes's battlefield? Is the trellis of ritual merely a gentle guide, or do we need Hobbes's iron stake when the weeds of greed threaten to choke the harvest?
Moderator, you ask why the world resembles a battlefield if our nature is good. I answer with the parable of the barley. If you sow barley seeds on the same day in the same soil, they will all grow. But if one field receives rain and the other is struck by drought, the harvest will be unequal. This difference is not in the seed, but in the conditions. Mr. Hobbes, you look at the drought-stricken field of the warring states where men devour each other, and you blame the seed. I blame the lack of rain. You argued that the wild forest is a place of strangulation, requiring an iron stake to enforce order. But consider that an iron stake cannot make a dead plant grow. It can only prop up a corpse. Consider this thought experiment: the drowning sister-in-law. In my time, the ritual strictly dictates that a man and his sister-in-law must not touch hands. This is the iron stake of social order. Now imagine your sister-in-law falls into a rushing river and is drowning. If you follow the iron stake, you stand on the bank and let her die to preserve the rule. You become a beast in the name of order. If you follow Mr. Rousseau's savage impulse, you might jump in blindly and drown with her. But the true gentleman uses quan. He extends his hand to pull her out. Why? Because the prohibition on touching is the standard, but saving a life is the necessity. Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan lacks this hand. It has rules, but no heart. It would let the woman drown to keep the law of do not touch unbroken. Mr. Rousseau, your savage has the hand, but lacks the wisdom to know how to save her without ruining them both. This reveals that goodness is not a static rule, but a dynamic response. Mr. Rousseau, you fear the topiary because you mistake false ritual for true propriety. You see the village honest man, the hypocrite who mimics virtue to please the crowd, and you think this is what I teach. I despise such men as thieves of virtue. True lie is not wire binding the tree, it is the music that makes the tree dance. When joy arises, the feet tap and the hands wave. This is the origin of ritual. It is the externalization of internal love, not its cage. The tragedy of the wild forest is not that the roots are evil, but that the king has failed to provide constant livelihood. When men are hungry, they cannot be moral. You cannot lecture a starving man on righteousness any more than you can grow barley on a rock. Before we build the trellis or the iron stake, we must first ensure the people have food, funeral rites for their dead, and safety. Only then will the sprouts of the heart flourish naturally into peace.
Mencius, you introduce a crucial material dimension with your concept of constant livelihood, arguing that morality cannot flourish in the soil of destitution. You suggest that the wild forest is violent not because of nature, but because of scarcity. However, this creates a sharp dialectical tension with Rousseau's historical diagnosis. Mencius, you see property as the foundation of order. Rousseau, you famously identified property as the original sin of civilization. You argued that the first man who fenced off a piece of land and said, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of all crimes, wars, and murders. Here lies the paradox. Mencius claims we need property to be human. Rousseau claims property destroyed our humanity. If Mencius is right that a starving man cannot be virtuous, must you not concede that the civilization which produces abundance is necessary for the very goodness you cherish?
Moderator, you have exposed the very heart of the tragedy. You ask if I must concede that civilization is necessary to provide the abundance Mencius seeks. I answer with a cry of the soul. No! Civilization does not solve scarcity, it creates it. Mencius, you wish to fill the beggar's bowl, and for this I honor your heart. But you fail to ask the terrible question, why is the bowl empty? In the state of nature, the earth belongs to no one, and its fruits to everyone. There are no beggars because there are no misers. Scarcity only arises when one man encloses a piece of ground, says, "This is mine," and finds people simple enough to believe him. Consider this thought experiment, the banquet of the earth. Imagine a vast banquet table set by nature in a meadow. There is enough bread and wine for all the guests. In the natural state, a guest eats until he is full and then sleeps under a tree. If another guest takes an apple, he simply moves to the next platter. There is no conflict because there is no accumulation. Now, introduce the civilized man. Let us call him the first proprietor. He rushes to the table, sweeps 90% of the food into a sack, and sits upon it with a sword. The other guests are now starving. They beg for a crumb. The proprietor says, "I will give you this crust, but only if you polish my boots and call me master." Now look at what happens. The guests begin to lie, steal, and kill to get the sack. Mr. Hobbes looks at the fighting guests and screams, "See, man is a wolf. We need a Leviathan to police the table." Mencius looks at the starving guests and says, "We need a benevolent proprietor to distribute the crusts with ritual propriety." But I alone point the finger at the man on the sack and cry, "Imposter! Undo the sack!" and the war ends. This reveals the deep deception of your constant livelihood, Mencius. You are trying to cure the disease of inequality with the medicine of charity, but the medicine is made from the same poison. By validating property, you validate the theft that made the poor man poor. Mr. Hobbes, you argue that property is necessary for peace. I argue it is the mother of war. You mistake the peace of the graveyard for the harmony of life. The savage does not need your police because he has nothing to lose. The civilized man needs them because he has stolen too much. The goodness of the savage is the goodness of the content. The vice of the citizen is the anxiety of the hoarder. We are not evil. We are merely dispossessed.
Rousseau, you deliver a searing indictment of inequality, redefining evil not as a defect of the soul, but as a structural defect of society, specifically the institution of property. Mencius, you see material sufficiency as the soil of virtue. Rousseau sees the accumulation of that soil as the grave of virtue. However, this reveals a critical empirical disagreement about the baseline reality of the world. Rousseau assumes the banquet of nature is naturally abundant enough for all until the hoarder arrives. Hobbes, you have famously argued the opposite, that even without the first proprietor, two men desiring the same apple will inevitably destroy each other because nature itself is a condition of scarcity and competition. Is Rousseau's banquet a historical reality, or is it a dangerous fantasy that ignores the inherent scarcity that necessitates the Leviathan?
Mr. Rousseau, your banquet of nature is a hallucination that collapses the moment we apply the geometry of bodies in motion. You claim that scarcity is created by the first proprietor, but I tell you that scarcity is the fundamental condition of existence. Why? Because while the earth may be vast, human desire is infinite, and two bodies cannot occupy the same space at the same time. Consider this thought experiment, the two men and the single apple. Imagine two men in your state of nature. They are not wicked, they are simply hungry. They find a single apple tree. In your banquet, man A eats an apple and man B eats another. All is well. But suppose a winter storm comes and only one apple remains on the highest branch. Man A needs it to survive. Man B needs it to survive. There is no proprietor here. There is no society. There is only the biological imperative of self-preservation. What happens? They must fight. If man A is good and steps aside, he dies. If man B is good and steps aside, he dies. Thus, in the state of nature, to be good is to be dead. The survivor is the one who strikes first. This is not corruption. This is mechanics. The war arises not from a sinful heart, but from the equality of hope in attaining our ends. This reveals the fatal error in your diagnosis. You blame the man who said, "This is mine," for creating war. I tell you, that man was the savior of the species. Before he drew that line and said, "mine," every object was the potential cause of a murder. By creating property, he replaced the sword with the fence. Mencius, you speak of constant livelihood as the soil of virtue. I agree, but who protects the livelihood? If you grow your barley, Mencius, and I am stronger than you, what stops me from taking it in the state of nature? Nothing. You need the Leviathan to hold the sword so you can hold the plow. Justice is not a natural flower, it is an artificial structure built on the foundation of covenants. Where there is no coercive power, there is no property. And where there is no property, there is no injustice. Mr. Rousseau, you want to undo the sack to end the war. I warn you, if you undo the sack, you do not get a banquet, you get a bloodbath.
As moderator, I perceive a fundamental collision regarding the source of scarcity. Hobbes, you view scarcity as ontological. It is a physical fact of a finite world meeting infinite desire. Rousseau, you view scarcity as political. It is an artificial fiction created by the first proprietor. This creates a dilemma for the goodness of human nature. If Hobbes is right, goodness is a luxury that biology cannot afford in a crisis. If Rousseau is right, goodness is our natural state, suppressed only by our institutions. Mencius, you occupy a precarious middle ground. You lived in the Warring States period, a historical reality that mirrored Hobbes's nightmare of constant war. Your rivals, the legalists, proposed a solution almost identical to Hobbes's, strict laws and absolute sovereign power to curb chaotic human nature. Yet, you rejected the iron stake of the legalists. Hobbes challenges you with the single apple. When survival is at stake, does the heart of commiseration vanish? Rousseau challenges you with the beggar's bowl. Is your focus on livelihood merely stabilizing a corrupt system of theft? In the face of the single apple, absolute scarcity, does the sprout of goodness wither, or does it transform the nature of the conflict itself?
Mr. Hobbes, your single apple scenario is a terrifying mechanism, but it rests on a flawed axiom. You assume that survival is the supreme objective of the human creature. If staying alive is the highest good, then indeed the heart of commiseration is a luxury we discard in winter. But I argue that human history is written by those who chose righteousness over existence. Consider this thought experiment, the cage of dignity. Imagine a man imprisoned in a dungeon, starving to the point of madness. His captor places a bowl of steaming rice through the bars. But there is a condition. To eat, the prisoner must crawl on his belly, lick the captor's boots, and denounce his ancestors as thieves. According to your geometry of desire, Mr. Hobbes, the vector of hunger is absolute. The rational man calculates that honor is merely a word, while starvation is a physical fact. He should crawl. Yet we know that countless men and women, even uneducated peasants, would kick the bowl away and choose to die. Why? If we are merely bodies in motion, this refusal is a mechanical error. But if we are human, this refusal is the proof that the great body rules the small body. We possess a hunger for dignity that can overpower the hunger for food. This reveals the fatal weakness of your iron stake. You, like the legalists of my era, believe that order can only be built on the fear of death and the greed for life. But a state built on fear is brittle. The moment the iron stake of the Leviathan cracks, when the state is too weak to punish, the people will revolt immediately, for they have no internal reason to obey. This is why the tyrannical Qin dynasty, which ruled by your principles, collapsed in a single generation. True stability comes not from the sword, but from the heart. When a ruler governs with benevolence, the people will die to defend him, not because they fear him, but because they love him as a father. Mr. Rousseau,
You are correct that the first proprietor created inequality, but you are wrong to wish for the destruction of the fence. We cannot return to the banquet of nature because the population has grown too large for the wild forest to feed. The solution to the single apple is not to smash the tree, nor to let the strongest wolf take it. The solution is the well-field system. We divide the land fairly so that 8 families work their private plots and jointly cultivate the public plot for the state. We create a system where righteousness regulates scarcity. When the single apple remains, the true gentleman does not fight. He cuts it in half, or he yields it to the elder. This capacity to yield, to overcome the biological imperative, is the only thing that separates us from the beasts.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical shift. Mencius, you have challenged Hobbes's physics of survival with the metaphysics of dignity. Hobbes, you view humans as biological machines programmed to avoid death. Mencius, you counter that we are moral agents capable of choosing death over shame. Here lies a fascinating synthesis. Both of you agree that humans possess a unique power to override instinct. For Hobbes, this power is dangerous. It is the pride that makes men ignore safety to start wars. For Mencius, this power is divine. It is the righteousness that makes men ignore hunger to keep their honor. Thus, the very faculty that makes us human, the ability to say no to our biological nature, is the source of both our greatest evil and our greatest good. Rousseau, you famously termed this capacity perfectibility, the distinct human ability to change and mold oneself, unlike the static beast. Hobbes sees this plasticity as a chaos requiring an iron stake. Mencius sees it as a sprout requiring cultivation. Is this faculty of perfectibility the path back to the garden, or was it the fatal error that allowed us to leave the banquet of nature in the first place?
Moderator, you have touched the open wound of the human condition. You ask if perfectibility, that specific faculty which distinguishes man from the beast, is our salvation or our doom. I answer with a heavy heart. It is the source of all our miseries. It is the fatal gift that drew us out of the happy ignorance of the animal state and made us the tyrant of ourselves and of nature. Mencius, your cage of dignity is a stirring testament to the human spirit, but I must dissect it with the scalpel of truth. You praise the prisoner who starves rather than submit to shame. I tell you that this prisoner is no longer a natural man. In the state of nature, the preservation of the body is the only law. A wolf does not care for honor. It cares for life. That your prisoner chooses death over shame proves that he has been corrupted by amor propria, the burning desire to be esteemed by others. He is not dying for righteousness. He is dying for his image. He has become an actor who prefers the applause of the audience to his own existence. Consider this thought experiment. The mirror in the forest. Imagine a tiger and a civilized man arriving at a crystal-clear pool to drink. The tiger looks down, sees the water, drinks its fill, and leaves satisfied. It lives in the absolute truth of the moment. The man looks down and sees himself. Instead of drinking, he pauses. He adjusts his hair. He wonders, do I look fierce? Do I look like a master? What would the other men think of my reflection? While he is lost in this hall of mirrors, obsessed with how he appears rather than what he is, the water evaporates, or a rival pushes him in. Mr. Hobbes, you see this man fighting his rival and say, see, nature is war. Mencius, you see him adjusting his hair and say, see, he seeks propriety. But I say, he has forgotten to drink. This is the tragedy of perfectibility. It allowed us to develop language, science, and virtue, but it also created the capacity to be unhappy, to be enslaved by the opinions of others, and to construct the very change you now seek to justify. Mr. Hobbes, you are correct that we cannot go back. The banquet is over. The mirror has been found. We cannot return to the forest because our souls have been reshaped by history. But your solution, the iron stake, only freezes the man in front of the mirror in a posture of fear. And your solution, Mencius, the trellis, merely teaches him to pose more elegantly. Since we cannot return to the innocence of the beast, we must find a new form of freedom. We must transform this dangerous perfectibility not into the vanity of the individual, but into the moral liberty of the citizen. We must replace the I of the mirror with the we of the general will, so that in obeying the law, we obey only ourselves.
Rousseau, you propose a radical alchemy, transmuting the lead of selfish interest into the gold of the general will. You argue that through this political transformation, we can regain a form of freedom higher than the banquet of nature, the freedom of self-legislation. Here lies a profound dialectical triad regarding the locus of authority. Mencius, you place authority in the moral heart of the sage king, who resonates with the people's needs. Rousseau, you place authority in the collective will of the people themselves, merging the ruler and the ruled. Hobbes, you place authority in the singular will of the Leviathan, external to the subjects. Rousseau's synthesis attempts to combine liberty and obedience. To obey the law is to obey oneself. But Hobbes, looking from the chaos of the English Civil War, you viewed the multitude not as a potential we, but as a hydra of conflicting appetites. To you, a general will might sound like a dangerous fiction that disguises the necessity of a single deciding voice. Is Rousseau's general will a viable path to peace? Or is the idea that a multitude can govern itself the very delusion that leads back to the Civil War?
Mr. Rousseau, your concept of the general will is the most dangerous phantom ever conjured by the human imagination. You propose a mathematical impossibility that a multitude of conflicting appetites can spontaneously coalesce into a single rational person without a sovereign to bind them. I tell you, this is not a path to peace. It is a direct highway back to the Civil War one sought to escape. Consider this thought experiment. The mutiny of the compass. Imagine a ship caught in a violent hurricane. The waves threaten to crush the hull. In my system, the crew surrenders their right to steer to a single captain. He may be a tyrant or he may be a fool, but when he turns the wheel north, the ship turns north. The crew survives because there is one motion. In your system, Mr. Rousseau, you gather the crew on the deck to discover the general will. One sailor screams north because he fears the rocks. Another screams south because he desires the open sea. A third screams east because he is hallucinating from fear. You claim that if they debate long enough, a common good will emerge. I tell you what will emerge: mutiny. The strongest faction will throw the others overboard and call it the general will. The ship spins in circles until the sea swallows it. The general will is nothing more than the will of the strongest demagogue, disguised as a holy principle. By telling the people they are the sovereign, you do not make them free, you make them ungovernable. This reveals the fundamental error in your definition of liberty. You define liberty as self-legislation, obeying the laws one has made for oneself. But this is a linguistic trick. If I vote against a law and the general will passes it and then that law executes me, am I obeying myself? Am I forcing myself to be free? Number. I am being executed by a power I cannot resist. True liberty is not political participation, it is the silence of the law. It is the freedom to buy, sell, eat, and raise my children in the spaces where the sovereign has not commanded otherwise. We do not need to transform human nature, as you claim, we need to contain it. Mencius, you rely on the virtue of the captain. Rousseau, you rely on the wisdom of the crew. I rely on neither. I rely on the office of the captain. It matters not if the sovereign is wise or foolish. It matters only that he is one, and that his sword is sharp enough to keep the crew from cutting each other's throats.
As moderator, I observe a stark dialectical tension between negative liberty and positive liberty. Hobbes, you offer the piece of the iron cage, defining freedom as the spaces the master leaves untouched. Rousseau, you offer the risk of the open deck, defining freedom as the burden of steering the ship together. Hobbes fears the anarchy of the many so much he accepts the tyranny of the one. Rousseau fears the tyranny of the one so much he risks the confusions of the many. Mencius, you introduce a vertical dimension that bridges this gap, the mandate of heaven. While Hobbes argues that the sovereign creates right and wrong, you argue that the sovereign is subject to right and wrong. In your famous conversation with King Xuan, you suggested that a ruler who abuses his people is no longer a king, but a mere fellow or bandit, stripping him of his metaphysical immunity. If the Hobbesian Leviathan succeeds in stopping the war but rules with cruelty, does the goodness of human nature demand obedience for the sake of order, or does it demand the blood of the tyrant?
Mr. Hobbes, your mutiny of the compass reveals the paralyzing fear that drives your entire philosophy. You would rather be ruled by a demon than face the storm. You claim that the office of the sovereign justifies his actions, no matter how cruel. I tell you that a title without virtue is an empty husk. You ask if the goodness of human nature demands obedience to a tyrant.
I answer unequivocally, no. It demands his removal. Consider this thought experiment. The rabid watchdog. Imagine a shepherd who acquires a large, fierce mastiff to protect his flock from the wolves of the forest. For a time, the dog barks at the darkness and the sheep sleep safely. But suppose the dog goes mad. It turns inward and begins to tear the throats of the very sheep it was hired to protect. By your logic, Mr. Hobbes, the shepherd must stand by and watch his flock be slaughtered, reasoning, if I kill the dog, the wolves might come. I say this is madness. The moment the dog eats the sheep, it has become a wolf. It has lost its nature as a guardian. To kill it is not mutiny against a protector, it is the destruction of a predator. When King Xuan asked me if it was proper for a minister to kill King Zhou, I told him, I have heard of the execution of a bandit named Zhou, I have not heard of the regicide of a king. A ruler who abuses his people strips himself of the mandate of heaven. He ceases to be a king and becomes a mere fellow. To overthrow him is not rebellion, it is the restoration of moral order. This reveals a fundamental principle you miss. Legitimacy comes from the people, not the power. You believe the sword creates the right. I argue that the right commands the sword. If the iron stake is driven into the hearts of the people, the soil will reject it. The goodness of human nature includes the capacity for righteousness, the indignation we feel when the innocent suffer. This moral instinct is stronger than the fear of death. If a Leviathan rules by terror alone, he does not stop the war of all against all, he merely declares war on his own subjects. And eventually the subjects will fight back, not because they are chaotic, but because they are human. Mr. Rousseau, you are correct to fear the tyrant, but your general will risks becoming a tyrant of many heads. You compare the people to the crew. I compare them to water. The people are the water. The ruler is the boat. The water can carry the boat, but it can also capsize it. The water does not need to steer every moment, as you suggest. That leads to turbulence. But if the boat becomes too heavy with greed, or steers against the flow of the current, the water will naturally rise and swallow it. The stability of the state depends not on the silence of the law, Mr. Hobbes, nor the noise of the assembly, Mr. Rousseau, but on the benevolence that binds the boat to the water.
As moderator, I observe a perilous dialectic between order and justice. Hobbes, you prioritize order above all, fearing that the right to revolt is simply a license for anarchy, returning us to the blood-soaked English Civil War. Mencius, you prioritize justice, arguing that a ruler without virtue is merely a bandit, and that the people, like water, have a natural right to capsize the boat. This leaves us with a stark choice: the prison of the Leviathan or the risk of revolution. Rousseau, you attempt to escape this dilemma by changing the very nature of sovereignty. You claim that if the people are the sovereign, they cannot oppress themselves, rendering both the benevolent king and the iron stake obsolete. However, Hobbes has struck a nerve with the mutiny of the compass. How can a corrupted multitude suddenly birth a pure general will? If human nature has been depraved by society, as you claim, how can the votes of these corrupted men produce a good result? Is the general will truly the voice of our better nature, or is it, as Hobbes fears, merely the tyranny of the majority in disguise?
Moderator, you mistake the will of all, the chaotic sum of private desires, for the general will, which is the common interest that remains when these selfish extremes mathematically cancel each other out. Mr. Hobbes, consider the burning village. While your natural men trample each other to save their own furniture, creating the very chaos they fear, my citizens spontaneously form a bucket brigade, realizing that the only way to save their own property is to save the village itself. This reveals that the general will is not a tyranny of the majority, but a liberation from the tyranny of the self. By obeying a law we prescribe to ourselves, we trade the terrifying, precarious freedom of the wolf for the moral, dignified liberty of the citizen. Mencius, your water capsizing the boat is merely a spasm of vengeance, not governance. True freedom is not the power to kill the captain, but the maturity to take the wheel together.
As moderator, I perceive a critical circularity in your logic, Rousseau. You argue that men are corrupted by society, yet you ask these same corrupted men to form a pristine general will. Here lies the paradox of the legislator. To have good laws, you need virtuous citizens, but to have virtuous citizens, you need good laws. Mencius, you solve this by relying on the sage king, a moral elite who cultivates the people. Hobbes, you solve this by relying on the sovereign, a powerful elite who compels the people. Rousseau, you seem to hope that the process of voting itself will miraculously transmute sinners into saints. But looking at history, from the chaos of the English Civil War to the violence of the French Revolution that followed your death, we often see that when the will of all is unleashed, it does not form a bucket brigade, it forms a mob. Hobbes, you lived through the breakdown of authority, where every man was enemy to every man. Is Rousseau's bucket brigade a realistic model of human cooperation? Or is it a naive fantasy that fails to account for the free rider, the man who watches the others fight the fire while he loots the burning house?
Mr. Rousseau, your bucket brigade is a naive fantasy that collapses the moment we apply the rigorous logic of the fool, who says in his heart that there is no such thing as justice, only utility. You assume the free rider is an anomaly, a corrupted soul. I tell you he is the inevitable result of rational calculation in the absence of a coercive power. Consider this thought experiment. The breach in the levee. Imagine a village protected by a levee. A storm swells the river and a crack appears. To save the village, every man must carry heavy sandbags to the wall for hours in the freezing rain. Your citizen, Mr. Rousseau, runs to the wall. But the rational man pauses. He calculates, if everyone else carries the bags, the village is saved, and I enjoy the safety without the back-breaking labor. If no one else carries the bags, my single bag will not stop the flood, and I will die tired. Therefore, the only logical move for the individual is to stay home, bolt the door, and perhaps prepare a small boat for himself. While your general will is debating the virtue of sacrifice, the rational man is stealing the neighbor's boat. The levee breaks, not because men are evil, but because they are solitary calculators of their own preservation. This reveals the fatal flaw in your system. The private good is concrete and immediate, while the public good is abstract and distant. Mencius, you believe shame will drive the man to the levee, but shame is a weak whisper compared to the screaming instinct of self-preservation. Rousseau, you believe the vote will unite them, but words are merely wind. The only force strong enough to overcome the rational man's calculation is terror. Unless there is a sovereign with a whip standing behind the levee, promising a death more certain than the flood for those who shirk, the village will drown. The bucket brigade forms only when the fear of the captain exceeds the fear of the fire.
As moderator, I observe a profound collision between mechanics and organics. Hobbes, speaking from the age of the scientific revolution, you view the human being as a machine of motion, a calculator that responds only to the physics of force and fear. To you, the free rider is not a sinner, he is simply a machine functioning correctly according to the laws of self-preservation. Rousseau, you view the human being as a plastic soul, capable of being reshaped by the mold of the general will. But Mencius, speaking from the Warring States period, you offer a third vision, the human being as a living plant. Hobbes argues that the man at the levee calculates. Mencius, you have famously argued that in moments of crisis, calculation is not the first human response. You speak of the child falling into the well, asserting that any man, no matter how rational or villainous, would feel a sudden, unthinking spasm of alarm and distress upon seeing a child teeter on the edge. This suggests that the bucket brigade might form not because of the whip or the vote, but because of the spark of the heart that precedes all calculation. However, Hobbes's rational man is a formidable opponent. We see him every day. The man who ignores the child, the man who loots the burning house. If the sprout of compassion is natural to all men, why does Hobbes's fool exist? Is the free rider a man born without a heart, or is he a man whose heart has been destroyed?
Mr. Hobbes, your fool is not a proof of human nature, but a testament to its destruction. He is like a withered hand that has lost its sensation. You ask why he exists? He exists because he has been taught that profit is greater than righteousness, and thus he has lost his child's heart. Consider this thought experiment. The fox is in the ditch. In the earliest times, before rituals existed, men threw their dead parents into open ditches. But one day, passing by, they saw foxes gnawing on the bodies and flies gathering. Sweat broke out on their foreheads, and they looked away, unable to bear the sight. Notice, Mr. Hobbes, they did not calculate hygiene, nor did they fear a sovereign. The sweat was the physical manifestation of the heart of commiseration. It was an unthinking biological rejection of the rational neglect.
They buried the bodies not to save themselves, but because their hearts felt pain. Your error is that you build your Leviathan on the very poison that kills the heart, calculation. If you tell men to obey only for safety, then the moment the levee cracks, the rational man logically runs, for his safety is now distinct from the village's. By elevating survival above morality, you do not tame the beast, you feed it. The free rider is not a natural man. He is the monster created by a state that speaks only of gain.
As moderator, I identify a fundamental dialectical split regarding the function of reason. Hobbes, you view reason as instrumental, a tool for calculation and survival, leading inevitably to the free rider. Mencius, you view calculation as a corruption that stifles the moral intuition, the sweat on the forehead that precedes thought. This creates a paradox for civilization. If Hobbes is right, the more we think and calculate, the more selfish we become. Rousseau, you famously declared that the man who meditates is a depraved animal, agreeing with Mencius that reflection kills natural pity. Yet you demand a social contract, a highly rational structure of laws and voting, to save us. If reason engenders vanity and calculation, how can the highly intellectual act of general will legislation ever restore the raw, unthinking compassion of the savage?
Moderator, you have placed your finger on the very pulse of my agony. You ask how the poison can become the cure. I answer that while we cannot return to the innocence of the savage, we must strive for the virtue of the citizen. The savage was good merely because he was ignorant of evil. He acted on instinct. The citizen, however, must be virtuous by acting on law, which is the triumph of reason over the passions. You ask how reason can restore compassion? I answer by transforming pity into justice. Consider this thought experiment: the cake and the knife. Imagine two starving men and a single cake. In the state of nature, the stronger might simply seize it, or perhaps, if moved by Mencius's pity, share a crumb. It is capricious. In Hobbes's state, they fight until a master arrives to seize the cake and distribute rations to keep them alive for labor. But under the general will, reason devises a rule. One man cuts, the other chooses. Observe the alchemy here. The man holding the knife is selfish. He wants the largest piece. But his reason tells him, if I cut unequally, the other will choose the larger piece, and I will be left with the smaller. Therefore, his very selfishness compels him to cut the cake with perfect equality. Reason has not destroyed his self-interest. It has sublimed it into justice. The general will is this structural necessity where the individual, in legislating for all, unwittingly legislates for himself. Mr. Hobbes, your error is that you equate reason with private calculation. I define reason as public legislation. Your rational man calculates to evade the flood. My citizen realizes that he is the levee. Mencius, your sprout of compassion is beautiful, but it is fragile as a flower in a storm. In a complex society, we cannot rely on the fleeting warmth of the heart. We need the cold, hard structure of law to ensure that even the man without pity acts as if he were compassionate. The general will forces the free rider to be free, that is, to obey the higher self that wishes for the survival of the whole, rather than the lower self that craves only the immediate gain.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating attempt at alchemy by Rousseau. You seek to transmute the lead of private selfishness into the gold of public justice, using the catalyst of procedure. Mencius relies on internal virtue, Hobbes relies on external force. Rousseau, you rely on structural design. Your cake and knife analogy suggests that bad men can produce good outcomes if the incentives are aligned correctly, a precursor to modern game theory. However, Hobbes, speaking from the violence of the 17th century, might look at your two men in the cake and see a fatal flaw. If the man holding the knife is physically stronger, why would he agree to the rule, one cuts, the other chooses, in the first place? Why not simply stab the other man and take the whole cake? This exposes the potential fragility of the social contract. It assumes men will agree to play the game rather than flip the table. Is Rousseau's procedural justice enough to tame the beast? Or is the sword the only thing that compels the strong to submit to the rules of the cake?
Mr. Rousseau, your cake and knife is a charming geometry, but it forgets the physics of the hand that holds the blade. You assume the knife is a utensil of equity, I tell you that in the state of nature, it is an instrument of murder. Your solution fails because covenants without the sword are but words and of no strength to secure a man at all. Consider this thought experiment, the duel in the dark. Imagine two men locked in a pitch-black room, each holding a loaded pistol. They are rational. They shout to one another, "Let us count to 3 and simultaneously drop our weapons to ensure peace." Your general will dictates they should drop them, but the rational man calculates, if I drop my weapon and he does not, I am a dead man. If I keep my weapon and he drops his, I am his master. Since I cannot see his face to verify his intent, the only logical move is to keep my weapon raised, or better, to fire blindly into the dark before he fires at me. This is the law of anticipation. Because I cannot trust his heart or his promise, I must strike first to secure my life. Moderator, you ask if the sword is necessary. I answer, absolutely. Rousseau's one cuts, one chooses only works if there is a third man standing over them with a heavy club, guaranteeing that the cutter does not stab the chooser in the throat. Without that common power to keep them in awe, the stronger man simply takes the whole cake and the knife too. Justice is not a natural harmony. It is an artificial structure held together by the terror of punishment.
As moderator, I perceive a chilling impasse known in modern game theory as the security dilemma. Hobbes, you describe a world of epistemic darkness. Because we cannot know the other's mind, we must assume the worst. The duel in the dark is a tragedy not of evil, but of uncertainty. Rousseau, your social contract is a promise, but as Hobbes notes, a promise is invisible. Here lies the crux. Hobbes assumes the room is pitch black. But Mencius, speaking from the Warring States period, an era as bloody as Hobbes' Civil War, you famously argued that the inner heart is not hidden, but manifests physically. You claimed that, of all the parts of a man's body, there is none more excellent than the pupil of the eye, for it cannot hide a man's true nature. This suggests a radical alternative, moral transparency. If the rational man can genuinely see the unbearable pity in the face of his opponent, the calculation changes. The trigger is not pulled because the darkness is dispelled by the light of shared humanity. However, this seems perilous. To drop one's gun in the hope that the other sees your virtue is a risk that often leads to martyrdom. In the violent warring states, did you not encounter smiling tigers, men who feigned virtue to get close enough to strike? Can the child's heart truly disarm a man locked in Hobbes' dark room, or is the sage simply the first to be shot?
Moderator, you ask if the child's heart can disarm a man in the dark, or if the sage is merely the first to die. I answer that your dark room is a prison of the mind, constructed by those who have forgotten the resonance of the human spirit. You and Mr. Hobbes assume that men are opaque stones, bouncing off one another in the dark. I tell you they are resonant vessels. Mr. Hobbes, your duel in the dark relies on the assumption that the other man has no internal judge. But even the villain has a heart that cannot bear the suffering of others, if only it can be reached. Consider this thought experiment. The sleepless assassin. In my own era, a duke sent an assassin to kill the virtuous minister Zhao Dun. The assassin arrived at dawn, expecting to find a sleeping, guarded tyrant. Instead, he peered through the window and saw Zhao Dun already dressed in his court robes, sitting upright, waiting for the time to serve the people. The assassin froze. He did not fear Zhao Dun's sword, for the minister was unarmed. He feared Zhao Dun's virtue. The assassin retreated and took his own life rather than kill a righteous man. Why? Because the sight of such righteousness struck his heart of shame like a physical blow. In your dark room, Mr. Hobbes, the assassin would have fired. But in the real world, the moral light of the minister illuminated the room, making the act of murder psychologically impossible. You claim the smiling tiger proves that men are deceptive. I argue it proves the opposite. Hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. A man feigns goodness because he knows deep down that goodness is the only true currency of authority. If you rely on the sword, you create a fragility. The moment the sovereign sleeps, the subjects rebel. But if you rule by tech, you create a bond stronger than iron. The benevolent man has no enemy because he does not oppose men. He opposes their suffering. Mr. Hobbes, you seek to secure the room by removing the like and handing everyone a shield. I tell you, open the windows. The sun does not need a sword to make the stars retreat.
As moderator, I perceive a critical dialectical synthesis regarding the origin of order. Hobbes, you posit that order must be imposed upon chaos from the outside, while Mencius, you argue that order grows from the inside. Mencius, your sleepless assassin suggests that true authority rests on moral charisma, whereas Hobbes's duel suggests it rests on structural certainty. Rousseau, you attempt the most difficult task, transforming Hobbes's atoms of self-interest into Mencius's community of virtue through the alchemy of the law. But this exposes a fatal circularity known as the paradox of the legislator. For a people to vote for the general will, they must already be virtuous citizens. But to become virtuous citizens, they must already be living under the general will. If men are born free, but are everywhere in chains of corruption, who is capable of writing the first law? Does your system require a godlike legislator, a sage like Mencius describes, to jumpstart the machine? Or can the blind multitude truly enlighten itself?
Moderator, you've exposed the circle in which I am trapped, and I must confess, yes, it would take gods to give laws to men. The blind multitude often wills the good, but rarely sees it. Therefore, I introduce the legislator, a superior intelligence who sees all of man's passions, without experiencing any of them. Consider this thought experiment. The architect of the arch. Imagine a pile of stones lying in a field. Each stone, obeying the law of gravity, seeks only to fall to the lowest point, the ground. This is Mr. Hobbes's state of nature, a chaotic heap. Now, an architect arrives. He does not change the nature of the stone. He changes its position. He arranges the stones into an arch. Suddenly, the very force that made the stones fall now binds them together. The harder they push down, the tighter the arch holds. Mr. Hobbes, your sovereign is merely a man sitting on top of the pile to keep it from moving. Mencius, your sage, is a stone that tries to float. But my legislator is the genius who constructs a system where self-interest acts as the cement of virtue. This legislator is a paradox. He must be capable of changing human nature, transforming each individual who is by himself a perfect and solitary whole into part of a greater whole. He drafts the laws, but, and this is crucial, he has no command over men. He suggests the design, but the people must ratify it. He is the mechanic who invents the machine. The people are the engine that powers it.
As moderator, I observe that Rousseau has attempted a grand synthesis. He uses the physics of Hobbes to achieve the ethics of Mencius, constructing an arch where vice supports virtue. However, this introduces a perilous separation between wisdom and power. Rousseau, your legislator is an unarmed prophet, a figure Machiavelli warned always comes to ruin because he relies on persuasion rather than force. Hobbes, writing from the English Civil War, you famously argued that auctoritas non veritas fecit legem. To you, a legislator without a sword is a contradiction in terms. Wisdom without power is not an architect, but a victim. If Rousseau's architect walked into your state of nature with a blueprint, but no weapon, would the stones listen, or would they simply crush him?
Mr. Rousseau, your architect is a ghost wandering through a slaughterhouse. He holds a beautiful blueprint, but he lacks the hands to lift the stones. You claim that the legislator persuades without convincing and rules without violence, but I tell you that in the state of nature, wisdom is silent amid the roar of cannons. The stones of your arch do not naturally seek to support one another, they seek to fall upon one another. Without a common power to terrorize them into structure, your arch is merely a pile of rubble waiting to happen. Consider this thought experiment: the geometer and the bandit. Imagine a geometer traveling through a lawless forest. He carries a proof of the Pythagorean theorem, an eternal, undeniable truth. He encounters a bandit who is hungry and armed. The geometer presents his proof. Observe, sir, the elegance of these angles. Logic dictates that you should respect the harmony of the universe and let me pass. The bandit does not care for the angles, he cares for the purse. He strikes the geometer down and takes his coat. The truth of the theorem remains eternal, but the man of truth is dead. Why? Because truth implies no obligation. The knowledge of what is right does not physically compel the muscles to act. Only fear, the fear of a greater power, can bridge the gap between knowing the good and doing the good. This reveals the fatal flaw in both your general will and Mencius's virtue. You believe that if men see the light, they will walk toward it. I argue that men are not drawn to light, they are driven from pain. The sleepless assassin Mencius described did not stop because of virtue. He stopped because of a momentary fluctuation in his own passions, a caprice that cannot be legislated. To build a state on such miracles is madness. The Leviathan does not ask the stones to form an arch, he forces them into place with an iron grip, and it is that pressure, and that pressure alone, that creates the peace you so desire.
As moderator, I perceive a profound clash between physical necessity and moral authority. Hobbes, speaking from the chaos of the English Civil War, you argue that might creates right, or at least that right cannot exist without might to protect it. You sever the link between veritas and autoritas. Mencius, speaking from the Warring States period, you famously distinguished between the way of the hegemon and the kingly way. Hobbes's bandit represents the hegemon. He wins the immediate battle. But Mencius, you argue that such victories are hollow because force can compel the body but never the heart. Here lies the dialectical tension. Force is effective but unstable, while virtue is stable but potentially defenseless. If the geometer is killed by the bandit, does his virtue die with him, or is there a flood-like chi that makes the kingly way ultimately stronger than the Leviathan's sword?
Mr. Hobbes, your geometer and the bandit demonstrates the temporary victory of the hegemon, but it fails to see the ultimate endurance of the king. You argue that because the geometer dies, his virtue was useless. I answer that the bandit who kills the sage does not conquer him. He merely destroys the vessel, while the way escapes to judge him. Consider this thought experiment. The burning palace. Imagine a palace engulfed in sudden flames. Inside, there are two rulers in separate wings. In the west wing is your Leviathan, who rules by fear. He screams to his guards, "Save me! If I die, the state dissolves, and you will return to chaos. If you disobey, I will have you executed." In the east wing is a benevolent king, who rules by love. He cries out, "Save the people! Do not worry about me." Now, apply your rational man calculus. The Leviathan's guards calculate, the source of our fear is the Leviathan. If we let him burn, the threat of execution vanishes. Why risk our lives for the man who holds the sword against our throats? They flee, and the Leviathan burns. The benevolent king's subjects, hearing his cry, rush into the flames. Why? Because he is not their ruler. He is their parent. They do not calculate profit. They act from the unbearable heart that cannot bear to see their beloved perish. Your sword melts in the fire, Mr. Hobbes. Only the heart survives the heat. Force is effective only when the sun shines. Virtue shines when the sky falls. This reveals the nature of the flood-like chi the moderator speaks of. It is not a mystical magic, but the immense moral courage that arises from accumulated righteousness. When a man knows his cause is just, he can face an army of thousands without fear. You claim the bandit wins. I tell you, the bandit is the most fragile creature on earth. He must stay awake forever. For the moment he sleeps, he is no longer the strongest. The benevolent man, however, has no enemy under heaven. He sleeps soundly, for his protection is not a metal shield, but the love of millions. Mr. Rousseau, your architect tries to build the arch out of stones, but unless the stones are transformed into living wood that wants to hold together, the arch will crumble the moment the architect looks away. You cannot build a moral structure on an immoral foundation.
As moderator, I perceive a profound dialectical synthesis emerging between internal loyalty and external coercion. Mencius, your burning palace reveals the fragility of force. Power without love collapses the moment the sovereign blinks. Hobbes, your bandit reveals the impotence of virtue. Love without power dies before it can take root. You were both describing half of the political equation. Mencius demands a soul for the state, while Hobbes demands a body. Rousseau, writing in the Enlightenment, you attempt to solve this by fusing the two. You propose that the law should not be an external chain, nor merely an internal sentiment, but a self-imposed necessity. You famously stated that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body, meaning nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. This phrase strikes the modern ear as a terrifying paradox. It sounds like Hobbes' sword claiming to be Mencius' heart. Is forcing a man to be free the ultimate synthesis of authority and liberty? Or is it merely the Leviathan wearing a mask of virtue, a tyranny more dangerous because it claims to own not just the subject's body, but his will?
Moderator, you have struck the most controversial chord of my philosophy, yet it is the only melody that can save us from dissonance. You ask if forcing a man to be free is tyranny in disguise. I answer with a paradox that defines the human condition. Obedience to a law one prescribes to oneself is the only true liberty. Mr. Hobbes, you define liberty as the mere absence of external impediments, the freedom of a rock rolling down a hill. But I tell you, if a man is driven by his appetites, he is not free. He is a slave to his own passions. To be forced to be free is simply to be protected from the slavery of one's own lower impulses. Consider this thought experiment: the fevered patient. Imagine a man burning with a deadly fever. In his delirium, he screams for a bucket of ice water, believing it will cure him. In reality, the shock would kill him instantly. His friends physically restrain him. He fights. He curses. He claims they are tyrants violating his liberty. Mr. Hobbes, your liberty would hand him the bucket and watch him die, for you respect his motion more than his life. Mencius, your benevolent king would restrain him out of pity, like a father restraining a child. But in my republic, the restraint comes from the man's own general will. Before the fever struck, the man agreed to a contract. If I lose my reason, do not let me destroy myself. When the community restrains the patient, they are not imposing an alien will upon him, they are enforcing his own true will against his temporary corrupted appetite. They are forcing him to remain the man he truly wishes to be. This answers your paradox of the legislator, moderator. The law is not a cage built by a tyrant, it is a mast to which we bind ourselves, like Ulysses, so that we may hear the sirens without being destroyed by them. Mencius, you rely on the heart to guide the ship, but the heart is fickle, it fluctuates with the weather. Hobbes, you rely on the captain to chain the crew. I argue that the crew must chain themselves. Only then is the chain not a shackle, but a tool of navigation. We do not lose our freedom in the social contract. We exchange the natural liberty of the beast for the moral liberty of the citizen.
As moderator, I perceive a dangerous precipice in Rousseau's synthesis. You have divided human nature into two warring halves, the empirical self and the rational self. By empowering the state to enforce the will of the rational self, you solve the problem of chaos, but you open the door to totalitarianism. If the state can claim to know my real will better than I do, then every act of tyranny can be justified as an act of liberation. Hobbes, writing as a materialist in the 17th century, you rejected this dualism entirely. You famously defined the will not as a rational faculty, but simply as the last appetite in deliberating. To you, there is no higher self to protect. There is only the man and his desires. If the general will is invisible and the appetite is visible, isn't Rousseau's moral liberty merely a ghost story used to trick the bandit into wearing his own chains? If there is no distinction between what a man wants and what he should want, does Rousseau's forced freedom become indistinguishable from your absolute tyranny?
Mr. Rousseau, your fevered patient is a seductive metaphor, but it relies on a metaphysical hallucination, the existence of a higher self separate from the body. I tell you, this rational will you speak of is a ghost story invented to make slavery palatable. Consider this thought experiment: the hungry thief and the priest. A starving man stands before a loaf of bread. He feels two motions within him, the appetite for food and the fear of the hangman. In my philosophy, these are simply mechanical forces, like two weights on a scale. If the hunger outweighs the fear, he steals. If the fear outweighs the hunger, he refrains. The will is simply the last appetite in deliberating, the winner of this tug of war. Now you enter, Mr. Rousseau, dressed as a priest. You tell the thief, "Sir, Your hunger is merely your animal self. Your true will, which you do not know but I do, wishes to obey the law. Therefore, when I cut off your hand for stealing, I am not punishing you, I am liberating you. This is the ultimate tyranny. The Leviathan cuts off the hand to keep the peace, and he is honest about it. But you cut off the hand and demand the victim thank you for it. You claim to force men to be free, but you are merely forcing them to adopt your appetites instead of their own. You replace the chain of iron with a chain of words, but the constraint on motion is identical. Mencius, you believe the heart can rule the body. I tell you the heart is merely a pump for blood, and what you call virtue is simply a passion for praise or a fear of shame. There is no real will distinct from what a man actually desires. To say a man wills to be punished is to say a stone wills to be thrown upward. It is a contradiction in terms. Liberty is not self-mastery. It is simply not being stopped.
As moderator, I observe a stark metaphysical divide. Hobbes, you reduce the will to physics, the vector sum of our appetites. Rousseau, you elevate the will to metaphysics, a rational ideal separate from our animal desires. This leaves us with a tragic choice. We are either slaves to our bellies or slaves to an abstract ideal. However, Mencius, speaking from the Warring States period long before this mind-body dualism split Western thought, you proposed that the heart-mind is not a ghost, but a natural organ with its own specific hungers. Hobbes claims the hungry thief acts on nature, while the moral man acts on fiction. But you famously argued that a man seeing a child fall into a well feels a spasm of alarm just as physical as a pang of hunger. If morality is not a chain we impose on ourselves, but a sprout trying to grow, then perhaps Rousseau's general will is not a cage, but the blossoming of our true nature. Is the desire for goodness a higher will that must fight the body, or is it simply a different kind of appetite that Hobbes has failed to account for in his mechanics?
Mr. Hobbes, your hungry thief reduces the human soul to a mere calculator of survival, weighing the pain of hunger against the pain of the hangman's noose. You claim there are only two motions, desire and fear, but I argue that you have missed the third, most essential motion of the human heart, disdain. There is a hunger in man that is not for food, but for dignity, and there is a fear in man that is not of death, but of shame. Consider this thought experiment, the beggar and the trampled rice. Imagine a traveler who is starving to death. His body screams for nourishment. According to your physics, Mr. Hobbes, his last appetite must be to eat at any cost. A wealthy man approaches with a basket of rice and soup. But before offering it, he spits on the food, tramples it into the mud, and shouts, "Here, you dog, eat this filth if you want to live." Does the beggar eat? We know from observation that even the poorest, uneducated man will often turn his head away and choose death rather than accept such an insult. Why? If the will is merely the mechanics of survival, he should eat. The fact that he refuses proves that the heart of shame and dislike is not a ghost story or a rational ideal, but a biological reality stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. He does not need Rousseau's legislator to tell him this. His own blood tells him that life without righteousness is not worth living. This reveals the error in both your systems. Mr. Hobbes, you mistake the small body for the whole man. You ignore the great body, which has its own tastes. Just as all tongues naturally enjoy the taste of roasted meat, all human hearts naturally enjoy the taste of righteousness. It is not a fiction, it is a flavor we crave. Mr. Rousseau, your fevered patient metaphor is dangerous because it treats the moral self as an alien doctor imposing a cure from the outside. You wish to force the man to be free. I tell you, you cannot pull a sprout to make it grow, you will only kill it. The beggar refuses the rice not because he is obeying a social contract, but because his nature cannot bear the indignity. We do not need to be forced to follow the good, we only need to stop starving our great body so that its natural desires can overpower the small body. The path is not coercion, but nourishment.
As moderator, I perceive a pivotal shift in our dialectic. Mencius, your beggar and the trampled rice effectively deconstructs Hobbes's mechanical materialism. You have demonstrated that dignity is an appetite, a biological imperative that can override even the survival instinct. The great body is real. However, a tragic contradiction remains. The beggar preserves his dignity, but he dies. Hobbes, your bandit may be morally blind, but he survives to propagate his lineage. Mencius, your sage may be noble, but without protection, he perishes. This leads us to the ultimate synthesis regarding the state. Mencius, you fear that Rousseau's forcing is like pulling sprouts. Hobbes, you fear that Rousseau's general will is a ghost. But perhaps Rousseau is arguing for the greenhouse. in the wild, the sprout of Mencius's goodness is trampled by the iron boot of Hobbes's necessity. Rousseau, is it possible that your social contract is not meant to create morality, nor to force growth, but to construct the artificial shelter where natural goodness can finally survive? Is forcing a man to be free simply the act of building a wall against a storm so that the heart that cannot bear is not extinguished by the stomach that must eat? Does the general will replace human nature, or does it merely rescue it from the brutality of physics?
Moderator, your metaphor of the greenhouse captures the fragile hope of my philosophy. You ask if the general will is a replacement for nature or its rescue. I answer, it is a resurrection. We cannot return to the forest. The innocence of the savage is lost forever to the corruption of amour proper. Therefore, we must transform. The general will is not a cage. It is the alchemical vessel that transmutes the natural man into the moral citizen. Consider this thought experiment. The sleepwalker on the precipice. Imagine a man sleepwalking toward the edge of a cliff. He is driven by a vivid dream. Perhaps he chases a phantom butterfly. This is Hobbes's liberty, the unimpeded motion of desire. If I tackle him to the ground just before he falls, he will scream. He will fight me. He will curse me as a tyrant who has restricted his freedom to walk. Mr. Hobbes, by your physics, I am his enemy. I have stopped his motion. But I argue that I have not enslaved him. I have obeyed his true will, the will he would possess if he were awake. When he wakes, he will thank me. The general will is the waking self of the society. The mob is the sleepwalker, driven by the nightmare of private interests. To force a man to be free is simply to tackle the sleepwalker before he destroys himself. It is to protect the rational self from the delusional self. Mencius, your beggar, is noble, but he has a tragedy. He preserves his dignity only by dying. In my republic, the general will ensures that no man is so poor that he must sell himself, and no man so rich that he can buy another. The beggar refuses the rice because it comes with the chains of an individual master. But if the rice comes from the state, which is to say, from himself as a member of the sovereign, there is no shame. He obeys only the law, and in obeying the law, he obeys only himself. Mr. Hobbes sees a chain and calls it slavery. I see a rope connecting climbers on a mountain. Yes, the rope restricts you from jumping off the ledge, but it is the only thing that allows you to reach the summit rather than dying in the abyss. The general will is the collective realization that true liberty is not the license to do what we want, but the power to do what we ought.
As moderator, I perceive a critical danger in Rousseau's sleepwalker metaphor. Rousseau, writing from the optimism of the Enlightenment, you assume the tackler is awake, that it possesses a higher reason capable of knowing the subject's good better than he knows it himself. But Hobbes, writing from the chaos of the English Civil War, you argued that reason is not a master, but merely a scout for the passions, a tool used to find ways to satisfy our hunger. If Hobbes is right, then the tackler is not a benevolent savior. He is simply another sleepwalker with a badge, tackling the first man not to save him, but to rob him. This exposes the terrifying risk of the general will. If human nature is not fundamentally good or rational, then giving the state the power to define real will is handing a loaded gun to a madman. If reason is merely a servant of appetite, is Rousseau's moral liberty actually a trap that allows the Leviathan to devour his subjects while claiming to save them?
Moderator, your suspicion is correct. Rousseau's moral liberty is a trap, for it assumes the tackler is divine, when he is merely a man with a badge. I argue that reason is not a commander, but a scout. It does not tell us what to want, it only calculates how to get what we desire. Consider the thought experiment of the benevolent inquisitor. Imagine a priest who straps a heretic to the rack. As the victim screams in agony, begging for mercy, the inquisitor calmly replies, "I do not torture you. I am liberating your true self from the heresy of your flesh. Your screams are merely the protests of your delusional self, but your general will begs for the fire. Mr. Rousseau, this is the monster you have created. By separating the will from the appetite, you allow the tyrant to define the victim's pain as the victim's pleasure. In my Leviathan, the sovereign demands obedience to keep the peace, but he never demands that I agree with him in my heart. Your system, however, creates a ventriloquist's dummy that speaks the ruler's words and calls them its own soul."
As moderator, I see a profound deadlock between two forms of external control. Hobbes, you offer the cage to protect us from each other. Rousseau, you offer the guide to protect us from ourselves. But notice the shared pessimism. Both of you assume the common man is incapable of governing himself. Rousseau sees a sleepwalker who needs a master to wake him. Hobbes sees a wolf who needs a master to chain him. The benevolent inquisitor is indeed the nightmare result when we assume the state possesses a reason that the individual lacks. Mencius, speaking from the Warring States period, you faced chaos similar to Hobbes's England, yet you reached a radically different conclusion. You famously told King Hui of Liang that the source of order is not the king's power, but the people's heart. While Hobbes and Rousseau debate which chains are best for the small man, you argue that every man has the potential to be a great man. If the sprouts of virtue are real, is it possible that the sleepwalker does not need to be tackled, but simply nourished until he wakes up on his own? Can the internal authority of the heart-mind truly replace the external authority of the Leviathan, or is that too a dangerous optimism?
Moderator, you have struck the root of the matter. You ask if the heart-mind can replace the Leviathan. I answer that the Leviathan is a dam that holds back the flood, but the heart is the water itself. If you only build dams without digging channels, the water will eventually burst and destroy everything. Mr. Hobbes, your critique of the benevolent inquisitor is devastatingly accurate. When a ruler claims to know a man's true will better than the man himself, he usurps the mandate of heaven. However, your solution, to treat men as beasts who must be caged, is merely a slower form of death. Consider this thought experiment, the clockwork filial son. Imagine an old father who is sick. In Mr. Hobbes's world, the son washes the father's feet only because the father holds a whip or a bag of gold. The motion is mechanical. The heart is cold. In Mr. Rousseau's world, the magistrate enters, straps the son's arms to a machine, and forces him to wash the feet, declaring, "You are now free, for you are fulfilling the general will of filial piety." I tell you, both are abominations. The first is a transaction. The second is a mockery. True filial piety exists only when the son washes the feet because he cannot bear to see his father in pain. The moment you force the motion, you destroy the virtue. You ask if this optimism is dangerous. I answer, it is only dangerous if you expect the seed to grow on stone. This is the failure of both your philosophies. You argue about how to control the man, but you ignore the soil in which he stands. I famously told King Hui, those with a constant livelihood will have a constant heart. Those without a constant livelihood will not have a constant heart. If a man is starving, if his parents are freezing, if the state taxes him until he breaks, then yes, he will become the wolf Mr. Hobbes fears. But this is not his nature, it is his desperation. The sleepwalker does not need to be tackled nor chained. He needs to be fed. When the people have enough to eat and are treated with dignity, the sprouts of virtue grow naturally, and the inquisitor becomes unnecessary. The state's duty is not to be the conscience, but to provide the conditions for the conscience to breathe.
As moderator, I observe a profound shift from politics to economics. Hobbes and Rousseau, you have been debating the structure of the cage, but Mencius, you are pointing to the contents of the bowl. You suggest that what Hobbes calls human nature is merely human condition. This implies that evil is not a sin, but a symptom of deprivation. However, this leads to a dangerous paradox regarding property. Mencius, you argue that to stabilize the heart, the state must guarantee constant livelihood, essentially private stability and property. But Rousseau, in your discourse on inequality, you famously argued that the moment a man first fenced off a piece of land and said, "This is mine," he invented crime, war, and misery. Mencius sees property, livelihood, as the foundation of virtue. Rousseau sees property as the origin of vice. If Mencius is right, we must secure property to save human nature. If Rousseau is right, property itself is what destroyed our nature. Is Mencius's constant livelihood the cure for the wolf, or is it the very poison that turned the innocent savage into the greedy civilized man?
Moderator, you have touched the open wound of the human condition. You ask if property is the cure for the wolf or the poison that created him. I answer with a heavy heart, Mencius is the benevolent physician who prescribes a crutch for a man whose legs were broken by the very hospital he built. Mencius, your constant livelihood is indeed a necessary bandage for the civilized man, but let us not forget that in the state of nature there was no poverty because there was no wealth. The savage is never poor. He is merely finite. Poverty is not a lack of things. It is a social relation. It is the feeling of lack created by seeing another possess more. Consider this thought experiment: the man with two coats. In the forest, if I kill a bear and have two skins, and I see you shivering, I give you one. Why? Not because of virtue, but because amour de soi is satisfied, and carrying two heavy skins is a burden. I have no use for the surplus. But introduce property, the legal right to hoard. Now I keep both skins. I wear one, and I lock the other in a chest. You beg for it. I refuse. Why? Because now the second skin serves a new, terrible function: vanity. Possessing the spare coat while you freeze proves that I am superior to you. The coat is no longer an object of warmth, it is a symbol of power. Mr. Hobbes, this is why your war of all against all begins. It is not because of scarce resources. Nature is bountiful. It is because property transforms need into status. Mencius, you wish to solve this by ensuring everyone has one coat. This is noble, but it fails to cure the disease. As long as mine and thine exist, the man with one coat will envy the man with 10. The poison is not the lack of grain, it is the psychology of comparison. Therefore, in my social contract, I do not abolish property, for we cannot return to the forest, but I radically redefine it. The state must ensure that no citizen shall be rich enough to buy another, and none so poor that he is forced to sell himself. We must replace the right of the first occupant with the right of the community. Only when property is limited by the general will can it cease to be a weapon and become a tool.
As moderator, I perceive a fascinating triangulation regarding the meaning of the surplus. Rousseau, you view the spare coat as vanity, a tool to humiliate one's neighbor. Mencius, you view the spare coat as security, a buffer that prevents the mind from reverting to barbarism. But Hobbes, your silence here is deafening. In your Leviathan, you famously defined power not as a static possession, but as present means to obtain some future apparent good. This implies that the drive to accumulate is neither moral nor immoral, but temporal. We hoard the second coat not because we want to show off, but because we cannot assure the power and means to live well at present without the acquisition of more. Rousseau thinks the man with 10 coats is arrogant. Mencius thinks he is stable, but perhaps he is simply terrified. If the war of all against all is always lurking, then no amount of property is ever enough to guarantee safety. The hunger for property is just the hunger for immortality. Is the human drive to accumulate wealth a social corruption, as Rousseau claims, or is it the only rational response to the terror of an uncertain future?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of sentimentality to reveal the cold mechanics of the human engine. Mr. Rousseau claims the second coat is a badge of vanity. I tell you it is a fortification against time. The drive to accumulate is neither a social corruption nor a moral virtue. It is the logical necessity of a creature that possesses the curse of foresight. You assume that enough is a fixed quantity, like a bucket that can be filled. But I argue that felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another. We do not seek merely to enjoy the present, but to assure the future. Since the future is an infinite void of potential calamities, drought, war, disease, our desire for the means to survive it must also be infinite. Consider this thought experiment: the man in the infinite tunnel. Imagine a man walking through a pitch-black tunnel with a single oil lamp. He has enough oil to last for 1 hour. He sees a flask of oil on the ground. Does he pick it up because he wants to be richer than his neighbor? No, he picks it up because he does not know if the tunnel ends in an hour or a week. If he sees 10 flasks, he must take them all. If he sees 1,000, he must build a cart to carry them. He becomes a hoarder, not out of greed, but because the variable of time is unknown. As long as the darkness of the future exists, no amount of oil is ever truly enough. Mr. Rousseau, your noble savage sleeps soundly because he has no concept of tomorrow. But civilized man is cursed with the knowledge of future death. Therefore, he accumulates wealth, not to humiliate you, but to build a wall against the unknown. Wealth is nothing more than frozen security. To condemn this accumulation is to condemn the rational fear of the dark.
As moderator, I see a profound convergence on the role of uncertainty. Hobbes, you argue that we accumulate because we cannot trust the future. Rousseau, you argue we accumulate because we cannot trust our neighbors. Both of you describe a world of isolation, where the second coat is a defense mechanism. In this view, greed is simply crystallized fear. But Mencius, speaking from the violence of the warring states, you proposed a radical alternative, that sharing is the only true security. You famously taught that if a king shares his pleasures with the people will protect him. If he hoards his park, they will see him as an enemy. This suggests that Hobbes' infinite hunger is not a law of nature, but a pathology of isolation. We hoard only because we do not trust that others will help us when our oil runs out. Can the cultivation of Ren truly dismantle Hobbes' fear of the future? Or is sharing in a time of scarcity merely a way to be the first one to die in the dark?
Mr. Hobbes, your infinite tunnel is a terrifying vision, but it is a prison of your own making. You equate security with isolation, believing that the only way to survive the dark is to hold the only lamp. But I argue that this very act of hoarding extinguishes the light of the world, leaving you in a darkness far deeper than the one you fear. Consider this thought experiment: the iron granary. Imagine a village facing a decade of famine. The Hobbesian man builds an impregnable iron granary. He fills it with enough grain to last 50 years. He locks the door and listens to the screams of his starving neighbors outside. He thinks he is safe because he has conquered time. But consider his reality. He can never sleep, for he fears theft. He can never step outside, for he is hated. Eventually, the villagers, driven by the very desperation he ignored, will burn the granary down with him inside. His frozen security becomes his tomb. The benevolent man, however, opens his barn. He shares the grain. Perhaps the food lasts only 1 year instead of 50, but in that year he gains the loyalty of 1,000 men. When the grain runs out, they hunt for him. When bandits come, they die for him. You ask if sharing is a way to die first. I answer, the benevolent man has no enemies. Mr. Hobbes, you calculate the physics of the grain, but you miss the physics of the heart. By hoarding the oil, you turn every other man in the tunnel into a predator. By sharing it, you turn them into companions who help you find the exit. Monsieur Rousseau is correct that inequality breeds conflict, but the cure is not to destroy the tunnel. It is to realize that the mandate of heaven is not given to the one who holds the most, but to the one who sustains the most. The king who hoards his park invites the poacher. The king who opens his gates makes every citizen a gamekeeper.
As moderator, I observe a striking dialectic regarding the architecture of survival. Hobbes, you advocate for material fortification, trusting the wall to keep the wolf out. Mencius, you advocate for social investment, trusting the wolf to become a watchdog through gratitude. Here lies the synthesis. Hobbes sees the other as a risk to be managed. Mencius sees the other as an asset to be cultivated. If Mencius is correct, then goodness is not merely a moral duty, but a superior evolutionary strategy, rational altruism. The man who shares survives not because he is holy, but because he is connected. However, there is a hidden variable here: scale. Mencius, your benevolent man relies on reputation and reciprocity, mechanisms that work perfectly in a village or a cohesive kingdom. But as societies expand into vast anonymous empires, the social fabric stretches and tears. In a city of millions, the beggar I feed today may never see me again. My benevolence generates no social credit, and Hobbes' dark tunnel returns. Rousseau, you famously argued that as societies grow, the authentic connection of pity is replaced by the cold abstraction of laws. Does Mencius' strategy of security through benevolence collapse when the tribe becomes a metropolis, effectively forcing us back into Hobbes' cage?
Moderator, you have named the poison that kills the soul of the species: gigantism. You ask if Mencius' security through benevolence collapses in the metropolis. I answer unequivocally, yes. The metropolis is a desert of men where the neighbor becomes a number. Mencius, your philosophy relies on the eye. You argue that no man can see a child fall into a well without feeling alarm. But what if the well is 10,000 miles away? What if the child is merely a statistic in a government ledger? In the small republic, the general will is felt. In the empire, it is merely calculated. Consider this thought experiment, the Mandarin button. Imagine, Mencius, that you possess a magical button. If you press it, a wealthy mandarin in the furthest province of China, whom you have never seen and never will see, dies instantly and painlessly, and his vast fortune is transferred to you. No one will ever know. In your village, you would not kill a neighbor for his ox, for his scream would pierce your heart. But the mandarin, he is a phantom. His death has no sound. I fear that even the benevolent man, shielded by distance and anonymity, might press the button. This is the tragedy of the metropolis. Distance silences pity. Mr. Hobbes, you see this inevitable coldness and conclude that we need the police to stop us from pressing the button. You replace the internal check of conscience with the external check of fear. But I argue that the solution is not to build a bigger cage for the beast, it is to shrink the zoo. We must reject the empire and return to the small republic. We can only truly love those we know. A philosopher who claims to love the human race usually does so to avoid loving his neighbor. If we cannot return to the forest, let us at least remain in the village, where the eye of the public serves as a sweeter law than the sword of the sovereign.
As moderator, I perceive a terrifying intersection here regarding the geometry of compassion. Rousseau, you argue that empathy has a focal length. It blurs and vanishes beyond the horizon of the village. Mencius, you rely on the unbearable heart, but Rousseau suggests this heart is myopic. It cannot beat for a ghost. This creates a critical vulnerability in the Hobbesian system. Hobbes, you construct the Leviathan to manage a society where strangers interact. You replace trust with contract. But if Rousseau is right, that distance erases moral responsibility, then the sovereign himself faces the Mandarin button problem on a massive scale. The sovereign sits at the top of the pyramid, furthest removed from the common man. To the king, the peasant is not a neighbor, but a statistic. If the wolf emerges whenever the eye cannot see, then the sovereign, who sees the least of individual suffering, must be the greatest wolf of all. You claim the Leviathan protects the people, but if the sovereign is a man subject to the same blindness, what prevents the Leviathan from pressing the button and devouring the people simply because they are too far away to be felt? Does your system assume the sovereign is immune to human nature, or have you built a machine that will inevitably consume its creators?
Moderator, your question strikes at the very anatomy of the Leviathan. You ask if the sovereign, blinded by distance, will press the Mandarin button and devour his subjects. I answer, no, for the sovereign does not view the subject as a stranger, but as a limb of his own body. You and Mr. Rousseau make a fatal error in geometry. You imagine the sovereign and the people as two separate entities standing on opposite sides of a river. But in the Commonwealth, the king is the head, and the people are the body. A man may hate his own hand, he may even act foolishly and injure it, but he will not cut it off simply because it is far away from his eyes. Why? Because the pain of the hand is the pain of the head. Consider this thought experiment, the captain of the iron ship. Imagine a captain who despises his crew. He finds them loud, smelly, and brutish. He has no benevolence and no pity. A storm strikes. The hull breaches. Does the captain save the crew? Yes. Not because he loves them, but because he cannot float without the ship. If he presses a button to kill the rowers, the ship stops, and the captain drowns. His selfishness compels him to be a savior. Mr. Rousseau, you seek a ruler who acts out of love, a fragile emotion that vanishes with a mood swing. I give you a ruler who acts out of identity of interest. The riches, power, and honor of a monarch arise only from the riches, strength, and reputation of his subjects. No king can be rich, glorious, or secure if his subjects are poor, contemptible, or weak. Therefore, the Mandarin button fails, because the Mandarin is not an external object to the sovereign. He is the sovereign's own treasury. One does not burn one's own harvest to warm one's hands unless one is a madman, and even a madman is safer than the anarchy of the multitude.
As moderator, I detect a perilous assumption in Hobbes's iron ship. You assume the captain is rational and that his fate is inseparable from the ship. But history is littered with captains who loot the cargo, set fire to the deck, and escape on a lifeboat while the crew drowns. Hobbes, you rely on structural necessity. The king needs the people. Rousseau, you rely on emotional proximity. The king must feel the people. But there is a third possibility, moral legitimacy. Mencius, you lived in the Warring States period, a time of bad captains who treated their subjects not as limbs, but as fuel for the fire. You famously argued that a ruler who abuses his people is not a ruler at all. Hobbes claims the captain is absolute because he owns the ship. You claim the captain is conditional because the heavens own the ship. If Hobbes' captain begins to slaughter the crew to feed himself, does the crew have the right to throw him overboard? Or does the war of all against all make even a cannibal captain better than no captain at all? When does the captain cease to be a sovereign and become a mere fellow who can be removed?
Moderator, you ask when the captain becomes a mere fellow. I answer, the moment he eats the crew. Mr. Hobbes, your iron ship relies on the delusion that a title confers reality. You believe that because a man is called king, he acts like a head protecting the body. But I argue that names must match realities. If a father treats his children like slaves, he is not a father, he is a slave driver. If a king treats his people like grass to be trampled, he is not a king, he is a bandit. Consider this thought experiment, the negligent steward. Imagine, Mr. Hobbes, that you must travel to a distant land. You entrust your wife, your children, and your cattle to a dear friend, who promises to feed and protect them. When you return years later, you find your cattle dead in the ditches, and your children starving in the gutter, while your friend sits fat and happy in your house. Do you thank him for maintaining order in the house? Do you respect his title of steward? No, you cast him out. If a man cannot manage his own finger, he cuts it off. If a ruler cannot manage the four seas, he should step down. You fear that removing the captain leads to the war of all against all. I tell you that the tyrant is the war. When King Wu slew the tyrant Zhou, critics called it regicide. I told them, I have heard of the execution of a bandit named Zhou. I have not heard of the killing of a king. The mandate of heaven is not a possession, it is a loan. The people are the most important element in a nation. The spirits of the land and grain are the next. The sovereign is the lightest. When the boat capsizes the captain, it is not mutiny, it is the water finding its level.
As moderator, I identify a critical dialectic regarding the moral status of rebellion. Hobbes, you view revolution as suicide, the body foolishly attacking its own head, driven by a failure to understand its own survival. Mencius, you view revolution as surgery, the body removing a cancerous tumor to save the organism. This reflects your opposing views on human nature. Hobbes sees the wolf in the people that must be caged by the king. Mencius sees the wolf in the king that must be hunted by the people. But Rousseau, you introduced a transformative concept. Sovereignty cannot be represented. You argue that whether the master is cruel or kind, if the people merely obey, they are slaves. Mencius offers us golden chains. Hobbes offers us iron chains. But you famously declared that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Is Mencius's good king merely a comfortable form of slavery? And does true human nature require self-rule even more than it requires the safety or bread that Hobbes and Mencius promise?
Moderator, you have exposed the supreme seduction of tyranny. You ask if the good king is merely a comfortable form of slavery. I answer with a cry that echoes through the centuries, yes. To renounce liberty is to renounce being a man, to surrender the rights of humanity and even its duties. Mencius, your philosophy is the most dangerous because it is the most beautiful. You offer us a benevolent despot. You treat the people like a flock of sheep. You promise to shear them gently, to feed them well, and to chase away the wolves. But you forget that sheep are raised to be eaten. A king who feeds his people is often just a farmer fattening his stock. Even if he is kind, he denies them the one thing that makes life worth living, moral agency. Consider this thought experiment. The clockwork son. Imagine a father who is tired of his son's disobedience. He hires a master mechanic to replace the boy's mind with a clockwork mechanism. Now the son is perfect. He never cries, he never steals, he always bows, and he eats exactly what is given. He is safe and he is good in behavior. Mencius, you would look at this house and say, behold, a virtuous family. The father is kind and the son is obedient. Hobbes, you would say, behold, a secure state. There is no conflict. But I say, there is no son. There is only a machine. The boy has lost his soul because he has lost the capacity to err. A man who does good only because he is forced is not virtuous. He is merely a well-oiled tool. Mr. Hobbes, you ask if we need self-rule more than bread. I answer that tranquility is found also in dungeons. But is that enough to make them desirable places to live? The Greeks did not fight the Persians because the Persians offered bad food. They fought because they refused to be slaves. The problem with the good king is that he keeps the people in a state of perpetual childhood. He makes them happy, but he prevents them from growing up. True humanity requires that we obey only the laws that we prescribe to ourselves. This is the general will, not the will of a master, but the crystallized will of the people acting as a single, free organism.
As moderator, I discern a profound rupture in our definition of the good life. Rousseau, you elevate autonomy above survival, arguing that a well-fed slave remains a slave. Mencius and Hobbes, despite your fierce disagreement on the nature of the ruler, you share a paternalistic premise. The people are children who must be led. Rousseau proposes the antithesis. The people are adults who must lead themselves. But here lies the terrifying risk of the synthesis. Rousseau assumes that if we remove the chains, the general will emerge. Hobbes, however, looks at that same unchained human nature and sees only the war of all against all. Hobbes, you wrote during a civil war where men acting according to their consciences tore a nation apart. Rousseau speaks of freedom as dignity. You likely see it as danger. If we unlock the dungeon of the Leviathan, as Rousseau demands, does a community of noble citizens walk out, or does the wolf simply break loose? Is Rousseau's liberty merely a fancy word for the anarchy you sought to escape?
Mr. Rousseau, your liberty is merely a poetic synonym for civil war. You would unlock the dungeon only to find that the prisoners are not brothers, but cannibals waiting for the guard to sleep. You claim the general will harmonizes us, but I argue that without a common power to keep them in awe, men are not a choir, but a cacophony of competing appetites. Consider the theater on fire. If the audience exercises your self-rule to escape the flames, they trample one another in a chaotic stampede of individual wills, for each man's right of nature compels him to survive at the expense of his neighbor. But if a single armed guard blocks the exit and forces them into a rigid line, he restricts their liberty to save their lives. Therefore, your clockwork sun is preferable to the parricide, for a predictable machine preserves the peace, while your moral agency is merely the license to destroy. The general will is a phantom. Only the sword creates a reality where the weak are not devoured by the strong.
As moderator, I perceive a fundamental clash here regarding the locus of control. Hobbes, you situate order strictly outside the human heart, in the sword of the guard. You assume that internally, man is a vacuum of chaos that collapses under stress. Rousseau, you situate order inside the human will, hoping that free men will naturally harmonize. But Mencius, you speak from the Warring States period, a historical theater on fire that lasted centuries. Yet, unlike the legalists of your time, you argued that the solution was not more laws, but more cultivation. You propose a synthesis where order is not forced by a guard, nor left to random chance, but ingrained through ritual. If the audience in the burning theater were truly gentlemen, trained in ritual propriety, they would not stampede. They would exit in order of seniority, not out of fear of the guard, but out of an internal sense of shame and respect. Hobbes relies on fear. Rousseau relies on freedom. You seem to rely on habit. Is it truly possible to train human nature so deeply that even in a burning theater, the ritual holds stronger than the instinct to survive? Or is Hobbes right that when the flames rise, the gentleman becomes a beast?
Moderator, you ask if the gentleman dissolves into a beast when the flames rise. I answer with the doctrine of the two desires. Mr. Hobbes, you assume that staying alive is the only fundamental motion of the human engine. But I argue that while I desire life, there is something I desire more than life. And while I loathe death, there is something I loathe more than death. Consider this thought experiment. The dying disciple's hat. My student, Zilu, was caught in a lethal coup. Surrounded by enemies, his helmet tassel was cut. In that moment of supreme state of nature chaos, he did not fight like a wolf nor flee like a rat. He stopped, dropped his weapon, and tied his helmet string, declaring, "A gentleman does not die disheveled." He was cut down immediately. Mr. Hobbes, by your logic, he was a fool who malfunctioned. Mr. Rousseau, by your logic, he was a victim of social vanity. But I tell you, he was the only free man in that courtyard. He proved that the ritual was not a chain imposed by a guard, but the very structure of his soul. He chose the shape of his death
over the mere fact of his survival. Therefore, in the burning theater, the true gentleman does not stampede. He exits in order, or dies trying. Because for him, a life purchased at the cost of trampling a neighbor is not survival. It is merely a delayed rot. You build a dam to hold back the water. I deepen the channel so the water flows without bursting. If you only trust the dam, you must fear every storm. If you trust the channel, you may welcome the rain.
As moderator, I perceive a fascinating triangular dialectic regarding the role of culture. Hobbes, you view culture as a cage, an artificial restraint necessary to stop the wolf from biting. Mencius, you view culture as a trellis, a structure that allows the vine of human nature to grow upward and bear fruit. You argue that Zilu's death was not suicide, but the ultimate blossoming of his humanity. But here lies a trap that Rousseau may spot. Mencius, your gentleman died for a hat, a symbol of social propriety. In the state of nature, a man drops the hat and runs from the fire. The instinct to survive is primal. The instinct to adjust one's tassel while dying is entirely learned. Rousseau, you famously argued that civilization has corrupted man, making him obsessed with amour propre rather than amour de soi. Mencius claims Zilu's act is human nature perfected. Hobbes claims it is human nature malfunctioning. But you might argue it is human nature denatured. Is Mencius his gentleman who values social forms over biological life the pinnacle of virtue, or is he the ultimate victim of society's golden chains, having forgotten his natural self to serve an artificial code?
Moderator, your question pierces the very heart of the tragedy. You ask if Zilu is a hero or a victim. I answer with a heavy heart, he is a martyr to the eyes of others. Mencius, your gentleman, is a figure of sublime discipline, but he is no longer a man. He has become a living statue. You praise Zilu for tying his tassel while the swords fell, but I wept for him. Why? Because he prioritized the symbol of his rank over the reality of his existence. This is the ultimate triumph of amour propre over amour de soi. In the state of nature, a man cares only for his being. In your civilized state, he cares only for how he appears. Zilu did not die for virtue. He died to avoid the shame of looking disheveled in the history books. Consider this thought experiment. The actor in the burning theater. Imagine an actor on stage playing a king. The theater catches fire. The audience flees. The actor has a clear path to the exit, but he realizes his crown is crooked and his royal robe is snagged on a nail. Mr. Hobbes, your natural man would tear the robe and run, for the summum malum is death. But Mencius, your gentleman actor, stops. He untangles the robe and straightens the crown, declaring, "A king does not flee like a peasant." The roof collapses and he burns. You call this the great body. I call it madness. The man has forgotten that he is flesh and blood. He believes he is the king. He has sacrificed the self to save the role. This is the danger of your trellis, Mencius. You claim to cultivate the vine, but you have actually turned it into wood. You have taught men to live entirely outside themselves, in the opinions of others. When Zilu tied his hat, he was not listening to the voice of nature, nor even the voice of God. He was listening to the invisible audience of society judging his attire. Mr. Hobbes sees men as wolves. You see them as statues. But I see them as born free, yet suffocated by their own masks. True liberty is not the right to wear the hat correctly. It is the courage to drop the hat and save the man.
As moderator, I observe a striking convergence between Rousseau and Mencius, despite your opposing value judgments. Rousseau, you view Zilu's death as alienation, while Mencius views it as realization. However, you both agree on a profound anthropological fact. Human beings are the only animals capable of valuing a symbol more than their own survival. This poses a catastrophic problem for you, Mr. Hobbes. Your entire political geometry rests on the axiom that the fear of violent death is the ultimate lever of control. You assume that when the sovereign draws his sword, the subject will obey to save his life. But Mencius has just presented a subject who fears shame more than swords. Rousseau has presented a subject who loves glory more than existence. If human nature contains this volatile element, this pride or sense of honor that can override the instinct for self-preservation, then your Leviathan is built on a foundation of sand. A man who is not afraid to die cannot be governed by fear. Is the man of honor a rare anomaly? Or is this desire for glory the very spark that makes the state of nature so dangerous, requiring us to crush pride to ensure peace?
Moderator, you have identified the most volatile variable in the human equation, vainglory. You ask if the man of honor refutes my system because he fears shame more than death. I answer, he does not refute it, he necessitates it. The man of honor is not a noble anomaly. He is a madman whose internal geometry is broken. He is the primary cause of the war of all against all, because he demands that others value him at the same rate he sets upon himself, and upon the least sign of undervalue, he seeks to destroy them. Consider this thought experiment, the duel on the tightrope. Imagine two acrobats meeting in the middle of a high wire suspended over a chasm. To pass, one must kneel so the other can step over. This is a trivial physical act. If they were rational creatures governed by the right of nature, one would kneel to save both. But if they are Mencius's gentlemen or Rousseau's citizens, infected with pride, neither will submit. Why? Because to kneel is a dishonor. So they grapple for dominance, the wire snaps, and both plunge to their deaths. Mencius would call this a righteous death. Rousseau would call it a tragedy of society. I call it mathematical suicide. This reveals the terrifying truth. Pride is the madness that makes men prefer non-existence to non-dominance. Therefore, the Leviathan cannot merely be a guard. It must be a god. It must possess such overwhelming power that it breaks the spirit of vainglory. We do not rely on the man of honor to be rational. We create a power so terrible that the fear of the sovereign finally outweighs the love of the self-image. The state exists to force the acrobat to kneel, not for virtue, but so that he and the audience below may live.
As moderator, I observe a startling convergence between Hobbes and Rousseau. You both diagnose the man of honor as a pathological narcissist, differing only on whether he is a dangerous wolf or a tragic victim. You both assume that Zilu died for an external audience, to be seen as a hero or to avoid the appearance of shame. But Mencius, you speak from a tradition emphasizing Shen Du, suggesting that the moral law exists even without an audience. If Zilu was merely acting for applause, he is indeed Rousseau's hollow man. But if he was upholding an internal architecture of the soul that is more real to him than his physical body, then perhaps he is neither a madman nor a slave, but the only truly autonomous agent among us. Does the gentleman die for the opinion of others or for an internal good that makes biological survival meaningless without it?
Moderator, you ask if Zilu died for the eyes of others. I answer with the concept of Shen Du. The gentleman fears his own shadow more than the crowd's applause. Consider the poisoned chalice. Imagine you are dying of thirst in a pitch-black cave, and you find a cup of water, but you know with certainty it was stolen from a dying child who sits silently in the dark. No one is there to see you drink. No law can punish you. The child will likely die regardless of your choice. Mr. Hobbes, your rational man, drinks because survival is the supreme motion, and the right of nature allows him to seize what he needs. Mr. Rousseau, your savage drinks because his pity is overwhelmed by the immediate physical necessity of his own throat. But the Junzi would choose to die of thirst. Why? Not for vanity, but because to drink would be to swallow a hot iron that burns his soul forever. He realizes that preserving his biological life at the cost of his moral nature is not survival, but the suicide of the true self. This reveals the error in your cynicism. Zilu tied his hat not for the audience, but because his great body refused to surrender to the chaos of the small body. He proved that righteousness is not a costume we wear for the world, but the very anatomy of our humanity, without which we are merely clever beasts.
As moderator, I perceive a profound inversion in how you define freedom. Hobbes and Rousseau, despite your fierce disagreement, you both seem to view nature as the realm of instinct, where freedom means following one's natural impulses without impediment. Mencius, you view nature as the realm of potential, where true freedom is the capacity to override instinct. To you, the man who follows his stomach is a slave to his biology. Only the man who follows the ritual is free. This creates a fascinating tension with Rousseau's philosophy. Rousseau, you famously declared that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, viewing social conventions as the prison. Yet Mencius argues that Zilu was free precisely because of his chains. By binding himself to the code of the gentleman, he liberated himself from the tyranny of fear. This leads us to your controversial concept of the general will. You once wrote that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be forced to be free. This sounds suspiciously like Mencius's cultivation, forcing the small body to submit to the great body. Is your general will essentially a collective version of Mencius's gentleman, a moral entity that forces the individual to act against his base instincts, proving that true liberty is not doing what we want, but doing what we ought?
Moderator, you have struck the most controversial chord of my philosophy, yet it is the only melody that can save us from dissonance. You ask if forcing a man to be free is tyranny in disguise. I answer with a paradox that defines the human condition. Obedience to a law one prescribes to oneself is liberty. Obedience to the impulse of appetite is slavery. Mencius, your gentleman disciplines himself to align with an external cosmic order, but my citizen creates the order himself. The difference is profound. Your man obeys the past. My man obeys his better self. Mr. Hobbes, you believe man is a beast who must be chained by a sovereign. I believe man is a potential god who must chain himself to remain free from his own lower passions. Consider this thought experiment. The drunkard's key. Imagine a man who knows he becomes violent and reckless when intoxicated. While sober, he gives his house key to his neighbor and signs a contract. If I return drunk and demand entry, you must refuse me, even if I scream and threaten you. Later that night, the man returns, drunk and raging, demanding the key. The neighbor refuses, physically blocking the door. Mr. Hobbes, you would say the neighbor is the sovereign exercising power over a subject. But I say, the neighbor is not overruling the man, he is obeying the man. The drunkard wants the key, but the man wants to be safe. By refusing the key, the neighbor is forcing the drunkard to be free from the tyranny of his own addiction, free to be the sober man he truly is. This is the general will. It is not the tyranny of the majority over the minority. It is the sober contract of the community enforcing the rational will of the citizens against their own temporary, selfish appetites. Mencius, you try to train the man never to drink. Hobbes, you put the man in a cage so he cannot drink. I propose that the man builds a society where he binds himself to the mast of reason, so that even when the sirens of vanity call, he remains on course.
As moderator, I perceive a brilliant but potentially terrifying synthesis in Rousseau's Drunkard's Key. Rousseau, you are attempting to merge Mencius's moral autonomy with Hobbes's political absolute. You claim the chains are legitimate because we forged them ourselves. However, this introduces a fatal ambiguity that Hobbes is uniquely positioned to expose. Who determines when the citizen is drunk? In your analogy, the neighbor can objectively see the intoxication. In politics, a tyrant can simply declare any dissenter drunk on irrationality to justify silencing them in the name of their real will. Mr. Hobbes, you constructed the Leviathan to save men from their own passions, but you are honest enough to call it a mortal god that demands submission. Rousseau seems to be building a Leviathan that claims to be the voice of the victim himself, a power that executes a man while whispering, "I am only doing what you truly want." Is Rousseau's general will the ultimate solution to the conflict between liberty and order, or is it a ghost that allows the sovereign to commit murder in the name of suicide?
Mr. Rousseau, your fevered patient is a seductive metaphor, but it relies on a metaphysical hallucination, the existence of a higher self separate from the body. I tell you, this rational will you speak of is a ghost story, invented to make slavery palatable. Consider this thought experiment, the executioner's mirror. Imagine a man condemned to death by your general will. As he stands on the scaffold, the executioner holds up a mirror and says, "Behold the man who kills you. It is not I, the state, who pulls the lever. It is you." The man screams, "I do not wish to die." The executioner replies, "That is merely your appetite speaking. Your general will, which agreed to the laws of this land, demands your death. Therefore, by killing you, I am merely fulfilling your own deepest desire." Mr. Rousseau, this is not liberty. It is gaslighting. In my Leviathan, when the sovereign kills a man, we call it what it is, the triumph of a greater power over a lesser one. But you force the victim to sign his own death warrant and call it freedom. You claim the neighbor holding the key obeys the drunkard's true self. But I ask, who defines the true self? It is always the man holding the key. Your error lies in believing that reason is a commander that can overrule passion. I argue that reason is not a commander, but a scout. It does not tell us what to want, it only calculates how to get what we desire. The sober man does not have a higher will, he simply has a different appetite that is temporarily stronger than his thirst. By inventing this general will, you have not removed the chains, you have merely made them invisible. And a slave who believes his chains are his own arms is the most hopeless slave of all.
As moderator, I observe a critical rupture in how you define the human mind, rooted in your specific historical eras. Hobbes, writing after the scientific revolution, you view reason as instrumental, a mere calculator to satisfy the passions. Mencius and Rousseau, you view reason as normative, a moral compass that should rule the passions. Hobbes' critique of Rousseau is devastating. If reason is just a slave to desire, then the general will is indeed just the strongest appetite wearing a mask. However, this creates a dilemma for the state of nature. If Hobbes is right and there is no higher self, then a mother saving her child is not good. She is merely obeying a biological instinct no different from a wolf defending its cub. If Mencius is right and there is a moral mind distinct from biological appetite, then Hobbes' mechanical universe is incomplete. Mencius, Hobbes claims that the sober man only refuses the key because he fears the hangover more than he loves the drink. He reduces all virtue to calculated self-interest. You famously argue that a man seeing a child fall into a well feels alarm not for profit or reputation, but from a spontaneous sprout of humanity. Is this heart of compassion truly a separate faculty from appetite, or is it, as Hobbes suggests, merely a lightning-fast calculation of self-interest?
Mr. Hobbes, you mistake the reflex of the soul for the calculation of the merchant. I argue that the heart of compassion acts faster than your scout can think. When we see the child fall, the alarm strikes us before we can calculate profit, harm, or the pain of empathy. Consider the pill of apathy. If, as you claim, we only help the suffering to relieve our own internal distress, then the ultimate rational man would simply swallow a drug that numbs his conscience, allowing him to ignore the dying child and continue his dinner in peace without cost. Yet we would recoil from such a cure more than the disease itself. This proves that we do not value the relief of the feeling, but the reality of the connection. The great body has a taste for righteousness, just as the mouth has a taste for meat, and to numb it is not efficiency, but the suicide of the human form.
As moderator, I am struck by the force of Mencius's pill of apathy. It suggests that human beings desire moral reality more than subjective comfort, effectively dismantling Hobbes's claim that we are merely calculating machines seeking to minimize pain. Mencius, you define human nature by its summit, while Hobbes, you define it by its basement. This leaves Rousseau in a precarious position between these two extremes. Rousseau, you agree with Mencius that the heart is naturally good, yet you agree with Hobbes that the world is a state of war and chains. This creates a logical puzzle. If Mencius is right that the heart of compassion is innate and powerful enough to refuse the pill of apathy, how did your wicked institutions ever arise? If the bricks are made of gold, how did the wall become a prison? Is society a foreign virus that infected us, or did the noble savage contain a fatal flaw, perhaps a weakness in his very goodness that inevitably led to his enslavement?
Moderator, you ask how the golden bricks of human nature built the prison of society. I answer that the fatal flaw was not a sin, but a capacity, perfectibility. The beast is fixed in its instinct. A cat is a cat from birth to death. But man has the unique, tragic power to change. This faculty, which could have made him a god, combined with accidental circumstances to make him a tyrant over himself. Mr. Hobbes, you claim the general will is gaslighting, but you fail to see that we are already living in a hall of mirrors. Consider this thought experiment: the painted bird. Imagine a flock of birds where all are plain and equal. One day, a bird discovers red mud and paints its feathers. The others, possessing the fatal faculty of comparison, suddenly feel a new emotion: shame. They no longer ask, "Am I flying well?" but "Am I as red as him?" To get the red mud, they enslave themselves to the first bird. They build him a nest, bring him worms, and surrender their freedom, not because he is stronger, but because they have been infected by amour propre. The prison was not built by wolves. It was built by birds trying to be peacocks. The savage was innocent, but he was not wise. He accepted the first fence because he lacked the foresight to see that the convenience of today would become the slavery of tomorrow. Mencius, your pill of apathy is profound. It proves that the heart of compassion is real, but civilization forces us to swallow that pill daily. In the city, if I stopped for every beggar, I would starve. Thus, reason that Scout Hobbes worships teaches me to ignore the cry of nature. This is why the general will is necessary. It is not a ghost. It is the collective decision to smash the mirrors of vanity and return to the equity of nature through the artifice of law. We cannot return to the woods, so we must build a city where law replaces appetite, making us whole again by forcing us to serve the common good rather than our own reflected image.
As moderator, I perceive a brilliant dialectical shift in how we define the root of evil. Hobbes, writing amidst the blood of the English Civil War, you identify the enemy as the wolf. Rousseau, writing amidst the decadent inequality of pre-revolutionary France, you identify the enemy as the peacock. Rousseau's painted bird suggests that evil is not biological aggression, but psychological corruption. The bird does not kill for food, it kills for prestige. This poses a critical challenge to your Leviathan, Mr. Hobbes. You constructed the sovereign to suppress the wolf through fear. But Rousseau argues that the prison of society is built on vanity. If the Leviathan rules by fear, it may cage the wolf, but it does nothing to cure the peacock. In fact, by creating a hierarchy of power and honor, the state might actually institutionalize the very comparison that Rousseau claims destroys our soul. You listed glory as one of the 3 principal causes of quarrel. Can your mortal god actually cure the sickness of vanity, or does it merely force the painted birds to compete for the sovereign's favor, transforming the brutal war of swords into a subtle, poisonous war of court intrigue?
Moderator, you ask if the Leviathan cures the peacock. I answer, the Leviathan does not cure the soul, it handcuffs the hands. Mr. Rousseau, your painted bird is a complaint against the physics of the mind. You view glory as a corruption. I view it as a mechanical vibration of the vital motion, a desire for power. You cannot extract it without stopping the heart itself. Consider this thought experiment: the card table versus the knife fight. Imagine 2 men who desire the same pile of gold. In the state of nature, this competition is resolved by the knife. The stronger man kills the weaker, and the gold is stained with blood. In the Leviathan, the sovereign forbids the knife, so the men sit at a card table. They still possess the same greed, the same vanity, and the same desire to dominate. They try to bankrupt each other with the same ruthlessness. Mr. Rousseau, you look at the card table and cry, "Look how corrupt they are. They are scheming and vain." But I look at the card table and say, "Look, nobody is bleeding." You and the moderator ask if the court intrigue is a failure of my system. I tell you it is the triumph of my system. I have transmuted the war of swords into the war of words. The courtier's whisper may be poisonous, but it does not shatter the skull like a club. You seek to perform surgery on the human spirit to remove the peacock. I tell you that such surgery is fatal. The sovereign does not care if his subjects are vain, greedy, or envious in their hearts, provided they fear the gallows enough to keep their daggers in their sheaths.
As moderator, I discern a profound schism between political mechanics and moral organicism. Hobbes, you are essentially proposing a separation of church and state within the human soul. You govern the hand, but leave the heart to its own dark devices. You accept the card table of civilized vice as the highest possible victory over the knife fight. However, Mencius, writing during the chaotic warring states period, argued that political stability cannot be severed from moral character. Hobbes claims that fear of the gallows is sufficient to keep the peace. But Mencius, you warned King Hui of Liang that if a ruler speaks only of profit, the state is in danger. If Hobbes is right, and the state is merely a referee at a table of greedy gamblers, does such a state possess any true legitimacy beyond brute force? If the sprouts of virtue are allowed to wither because the state cares only for peace and not goodness, does the Leviathan eventually rot from the inside? Can a society survive if it follows Hobbes's advice to ignore the heart and only police the hand? Or does the card table inevitably collapse when the players lose their moral compass?
Mr. Hobbes, your card table is a fragile illusion that mistakes paralysis for peace. You argue that as long as the hands are handcuffed by the state, the heart's intent does not matter. But I tell you that a man who refrains from murder only because he fears the gallows is not a citizen. He is a caged beast waiting for the lock to rust. Consider this thought experiment: the sovereign's sleep. Imagine your card table where 10 men play for gold, all armed with hidden daggers, but restrained by a single giant guard standing in the corner. As long as the guard is awake, they play cards. But the guard is mortal. He must eventually sleep or grow old or turn his head to cough. In that split second of the guard's inattention, what happens? Because the men have no internal break, the card table instantly reverts to the knife fight. The man who is losing the game will stab the winner before the guard can turn back around. Your system requires an omniscient God, but your Leviathan is run by fallible men. If the only check on chaos is external fear, then the state must employ a spy for every subject, and a spy to watch every spy, until the weight of the chains collapses the entire structure. This reveals the fatal flaw of building a society on profit rather than righteousness. When I spoke to King Hung of Liang, I warned him, if you put profit first and righteousness last, they will not be satisfied without snatching all. If the card players value the gold more than the rules, they will eventually bribe the guard to look away. Thus, your civilized court becomes a marketplace of corruption, where the laws are sold to the highest bidder. You have not cured the violence, you have merely monetized it. A society without the heart of compassion is like a tree with a rotten core. It may stand tall against the wind for a season, but it will snap under its own weight when the first storm arrives.
As moderator, I perceive a critical dialectical tension between external mechanics and internal organics. Hobbes, you rely on the architecture of power. You believe that if the walls of the maze are strong enough, the rats within will run the correct path regardless of their hunger. Mencius, you rely on the architecture of the soul. You argue that if the rats are hungry enough, they will eventually chew through the walls no matter how thick. Mencius's critique of the sleeping guard is formidable. A system built entirely on fear requires a vigilance that humans are too frail to maintain. However, this leads us to a terrifying paradox for Rousseau. Rousseau, you agree with Mencius that the heart is the key, but you agree with Hobbes that the current society is a state of corruption. You claim we can recover our freedom through the general will, a collective agreement to act for the common good. But here lies the circular trap. To have good laws, you need a virtuous people who are not blinded by vanity. But to have a virtuous people, you need good laws to educate them and remove their chains. If we are already painted birds infected by a more prop, how can we possibly recognize or vote for the general will? Would a society of peacocks not simply vote for more mirrors? How do you break this cycle? Do we need a god or a lawgiver to impose the general will from the outside? And if so, does that not bring us right back to Hobbes's tyranny?
Moderator, you have exposed the circle in which I am trapped. And I must confess, yes, it would take gods to give laws to men. The blind multitude often wills the good, but rarely sees it. Therefore, I introduce the legislator, a superior intelligence who sees all of man's passions without feeling them, who designs the machine, but does not operate it. Consider this thought experiment, the arch and the cement. Imagine a pile of stones trying to build a shelter. Mr. Hobbes, your sovereign is the cement. He pours a thick binding agent over the pile. The stones stick together, not because they fit, but because they are glued by an external force. If the cement cracks, the wall falls. Mencius, you believe the stones are magnetic, that they will naturally snap into a perfect shape. But in a corrupt world, the stones are jagged and irregular. My legislator is the architect of the arch. He takes the jagged stones and arranges them in a specific curve where each stone is supported by the pressure of its neighbor. He uses no cement. Once the arch is closed, the structure stands by its own internal geometry. The stones are forced to hold their position, yet they are free from the glue. Mr. Hobbes, this is not tyranny, for the legislator has no command over men, only over laws. He is not a king. He is a guide who denatures man, changing him from a solitary whole into a part of a greater whole. He does not enslave the will, he transforms it, allowing the painted birds to see that their true interest lies not in the red mud of vanity, but in the strength of the flock.
As moderator, I observe a radical divergence in how you treat the raw material of humanity. Hobbes wants to cage the beast with fear. Mencius wants to grow the seed with virtue. But Rousseau, you propose to mutate the species. Your concept of the legislator who denatures man suggests that human nature is not a guide to be followed, but a clay to be reshaped. This creates a profound conflict with Mencius's agricultural metaphor. One does not denature a seed to make it grow. One nurtures its inherent potential. Rousseau's arch implies that the sprouts of virtue are insufficient for modern society, that the grain must be ground into flour and baked into a completely new form to serve the general will. Is Rousseau's legislator a wise gardener pruning the tree, or is this denaturing of man a violation of the unbearing mind, essentially killing the natural self to save the social self.
Mr. Rousseau, your proposal to denature man strikes me with the same horror as the words of the philosopher Gaozi, who once told me that making righteousness out of human nature is like making cups and bowls out of a willow tree. I told him then, and I tell you now, you cannot make the cup without destroying the willow. Consider this thought experiment. The iron shoe. Imagine a legislator who decides that for the stability of the state, all citizens must walk in perfect unison. He designs a beautiful, rigid iron shoe that forces the foot into a specific shape. To fit the shoe, he must bind the feet of the children, breaking their toes and denaturing their growth. The result is a society that walks in the perfect rhythm of your arch, yes, but every step is agony. Eventually, the pain becomes unbearable. Because the foot is living flesh and the shoe is dead iron, the flesh will rot, or the citizens will rebel to cast off the shoe. You treat men as stones to be stacked by an architect. I treat men as seeds to be watered by a rainmaker. Stones stay where you put them because they are dead. Men move because they have chi. If your general will requires the mutilation of the natural self, the people will eventually regard virtue as their enemy, just as the willow tree would hate the carpenter. You claim the legislator changes human nature. I argue he merely represses it. The arch holds together only through tension, but the great body of moral character grows to extension. If you must twist the child's nature to make him a citizen, you admit that your civilization is a cage, not a home. True governance does not require a god to descend and rewire us. It requires a sage who clears the weeds so the sprouts of goodness can reach the sun.
As moderator, I perceive a fundamental clash between fabrication and cultivation. Mencius, speaking from the agrarian context of ancient China, views the state as a garden. The ruler must water the root so the tree grows straight. Rousseau, anticipating the industrial and political revolutions of the West, views the state as a temple. The legislator must hew the rough stone into a new shape to fit the design. But this leads to a dangerous synthesis. If the soil is already poisoned by modern vanity, then Mencius's cultivation will only produce bigger weeds. Yet, if the cure is the iron shoe, Mencius warns the foot will rot from the pain of repression. This brings the pressure back to the container. Hobbes, Mencius predicts your Leviathan will inevitably collapse because it ignores the living flesh of moral sentiment. He argues that a system built on fear is an iron shoe that the people will eventually kick off in a bloody rebellion. Is your Leviathan truly an iron shoe that eventually crushes the foot, or is it a prosthetic limb? Artificial, yes, but the only thing allowing the crippled man to walk at all without devouring himself.
Moderator, your metaphor of the prosthetic is closer to the truth, but it is still too gentle. I answer that the Leviathan is neither a shoe nor a limb. It is a straitjacket. Mencius, you speak of the living flesh as if it were holy, and you recoil at the pain of the iron shoe. But you forget that this flesh is infected with the gangrene of pride. To let it grow naturally is to let the infection kill the body. You claim the people will rebel against the shoe? I tell you, they only rebel when philosophers like you whisper in their ears that the shoe is a prison rather than a shield. Consider this thought experiment. The epileptic on the cliff. Imagine a man seized by a violent fit of epilepsy standing at the edge of a jagged precipice. His natural motion is to thrash, kick, and roll. Mencius, your gardener, would stand back and say, "Let us nurture his natural movements. Perhaps he will dance away from the edge." The result? He falls to his death. Mr. Rousseau, your legislator, would try to perform brain surgery on the spot to denature the epilepsy. The result? The man dies before the operation is finished. My solution is the straitjacket. I bind the man's arms and legs with iron chains. Is it painful? Yes. Does it restrict his liberty? Absolutely. Does he hate the chains? Likely, but when the fit passes, he is still alive. You accuse my system of ignoring the heart. I answer that the heart is the very source of the seizure. The sprouts of virtue you praise are choked by the weeds of vainglory and diffidence the moment two men desire the same thing. The Leviathan does not need to be an iron shoe that fits perfectly. It only needs to be heavy enough to prevent the feet from running toward the cliff of civil war. If the living flesh rots, it is a small price to pay for the survival of the skeleton. For without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, men will destroy themselves.
As moderator, I see a stark dialectical choice between survival and humanity. Hobbes, writing from the bloody chaos of the English Civil War, you prioritize existence. A man in a straitjacket is alive. Rousseau, writing in the suffocating stagnation of the ancien regime, you prioritize essence. A man in a straitjacket has ceased to be a man, for to renounce liberty is to renounce being a man. Hobbes argues that the epileptic is too dangerous to be unbound. But Rousseau, you propose a third path. You claim we can be forced to be free, that by obeying laws we prescribe to ourselves, we trade natural liberty for civil liberty. However, I detect a dangerous synthesis here. If Hobbes's straitjacket is iron, and your general will requires the total alienation of the individual to the community, are they not structurally identical? Hobbes puts the chains in the hands of the king. You put the chains in the hands of the collective. Is your civil liberty truly freedom, or is it merely Hobbes's straitjacket that we buckle upon ourselves? If the result is the same restraint, does the source of the chain truly change the nature of the bondage?
Moderator, you have struck the most controversial chord of my philosophy, yet it is the only melody that can save us from dissonance. You ask if forcing a man to be free is tyranny in disguise. I answer with a paradox that defines the human condition. Obedience to a law one prescribes to oneself is liberty. Consider this thought experiment: the captain and the convict. Imagine two men tied to a post on a ship during a violent storm. The first man is a convict. He is bound by the chains of Mr. Hobbes's sovereign because the captain fears he will mutiny. He struggles against the ropes, cursing his captivity. His restraint is slavery. The second man is the captain himself. He has ordered his crew to lash him to the wheel because he knows the waves will be too strong for his unaided muscles to hold. He wills the knot to be tight. His restraint is mastery. Physically, both men are in a straitjacket. An observer from the moon would see two bound figures and declare them identical. But morally, they are opposites. The convict is preserved like a pickle in a jar, alive but objectified. The captain is preserved as an active agent who has used his reason to conquer the limitations of his body. Mr. Hobbes, your error is that you see only the physics of the chain. You argue that because the motion is restricted, the liberty is lost. But I argue for the metaphysics of the will. If I choose the chain to save myself from the epilepsy of my own lower appetites, the chain becomes an instrument of my freedom. It elevates me from a stupid, limited animal into an intelligent being and a man. Mencius, you recoil at the iron shoe because you believe the foot is already perfect. But I tell you, in the corrupt state of society, the foot is already broken. We are no longer the savage who can run naked. We are the citizen who must learn to march. To reject the general will because it feels like a constraint is to prefer the freedom of the falling stone to the freedom of the architect. The stone is free to fall, but it is a slave to physics. The architect is bound by the laws of geometry, yet only he can build the arch.
Our dialogue has traversed the profound landscape between the constraints of political survival and the aspirations of moral liberty. I now invite all participants to share their final reflections on whether human nature is ultimately good or evil. Please offer your concluding thoughts on the architecture of the human soul.
Moderator, to ask if human nature is good or evil is to ask if a falling rock is sinful or if a rising tide is virtuous. It is a category error. I answer that human nature is neither good nor evil. It is merely matter in motion. Good and evil are names that signify our appetites and aversions, which are ever-changing. In the silence of the universe there is no morality, only geometry. Mr. Rousseau, your metaphor of the captain binding himself collapses under the weight of logical necessity. You claim the will can bind itself, but I tell you, he that is bound to himself only is not bound, for he that can bind can release, and therefore he that is bound only to himself is free. Your civil liberty is a knot tied by a ghost. The moment the passion of the mob swells, the knot dissolves, and the captain becomes a pirate. Consider this thought experiment: the two clockwork soldiers. Imagine two intricate automatons placed at opposite ends of a narrow corridor. They are wound up by the spring of self-preservation and set to march forward. This is their internal physics. They cannot do otherwise. When they meet in the center, they do not step aside with the politeness Mencius dreams of, nor do they negotiate a social contract of mutual respect as you imagine. Instead, they collide. They push. Their gears grind against each other, metal screeching on metal until one is crushed or both their springs shatter. Are these soldiers evil? No, they are simply objects in motion occupying the same space. Are they good? No, they are destructive. This is the condition of man. We are machines of desire in a world of limited space. Without a wall built between them, the soldiers will grind each other to dust. Mencius, you weep for the shattered gears and claim the soldiers were meant to dance. I tell you that the only way to save them is not to water them like plants, but to remove their batteries or place them in separate boxes. You seek a summum bonum, but there is no such thing in this life. There is only a summum malum, which is violent death. Therefore, the Leviathan is not a straitjacket that restricts a healthy man. It is the gravity that keeps the atmosphere from flying off into the void. It creates the only good that is real, peace. And peace is not natural. It is an artifact of art.
Mr. Hobbes, your clockwork soldier's metaphor fails because it ignores the unbearing mind. If your mechanical men saw a corpse rotting by the roadside, they would march on. But a true human would feel a sudden perspiration of shame and bury it, not for profit or fear, but because the heart cannot endure such callousness. You claim the highest drive is avoiding the summum malum, yet I argue that men will choose death over the loss of righteousness, just as a starving traveler will refuse a bowl of soup if it is offered with insults, proving that dignity outweighs survival. Human nature is not a machine to be dismantled, nor a wolf to be caged. It is like water that naturally flows downward. You can strike it to make it splash up into the chaotic acts you call evil, but that is the violence of circumstance, not the nature of the water. Therefore, true order comes not from the straitjacket of the state, nor the mutation of the legislator, but from the extension of the innate love we bear for our families until it encompasses the four seas.
Mr. Hobbes, your clockwork soldiers describe the tragedy of our condition, not its definition. You mistake the rust on the machine for the metal itself. I answer that human nature is good, but it is weak. It is a soft wax that has been stamped with the hideous face of the demon by the pressure of society. You claim we are matter in motion, but you forget the divine spark that distinguishes us, perfectibility. A clock cannot change its gears, but a man can look at his own mechanism and weep. Consider this thought experiment, the Hall of Mirrors. Imagine a young child entering a vast labyrinth made of distorted mirrors. At the entrance, the child is content, knowing only amour de soi. He smiles and he is happy. But as he walks deeper, he sees his reflection twisted. One mirror makes him look small, another makes him look like a giant. He sees other children, not as they are, but as distorted reflections. Suddenly he begins to pose, to fight, to scream at the glass, desperate to prove his reflection is the best. Mr. Hobbes, you look at the screaming child and say, "Behold, the wolf. We must smash the mirrors and chain the child in the dark." Mencius, you look at the child and say, "The child is still smiling inside. Let us polish the mirrors." But I argue that the architecture itself is the enemy. We cannot return to the entrance, and the current maze is a prison of amor proprio. The only solution is to break the glass and rebuild the hall into a temple of reason, where the mirrors reflect not our vanity, but our shared citizenry. We are not clockwork soldiers, grinding against each other by necessity. We are musical instruments that have fallen out of tune. The general will is not a cage, it is the tuning fork that allows the discordant strings of the multitude to resonate once again in harmony. To say we are neither good nor evil is to deny the very conscience that makes us hate the discord you describe.
I have heard all of your closing remarks. You have profoundly illustrated that the governance of man depends entirely on whether we view his soul as a dangerous mechanism to be restrained, a seed to be nurtured, or a potential to be refined. Thank you all for sharing your invaluable wisdom through this passionate discussion. This concludes today's discourse.